Chapter 2590. After gaining that understanding, he was no longer in a hurry to sink into the source of the cold law to absorb the endless laws within. The source of the cold law looked like a ball of cold air. In the boundless ice layer, there was no ice in the surrounding area. Instead, it was like a strange void with countless layers of space-time stacked within it. Here, space-time was in an extremely strange state. It seemed to be extremely chaotic, but it also seemed to follow some incomprehensible law. The changes seemed to be random, but it also seemed like there was an incomprehensible purpose in it. Under such circumstances, it seemed like any conjecture regarding the source of the cold law could be explained. However, no conjecture could truly explain the mysteries behind it. At this moment, the place where Luo Fan was had already left the ice layer and was within the range of the space-time distortion. In other words, he was in an area that he had not encountered since entering the ice layer. It was an area that was not covered by ice. The many branch meridians were actually not completely in contact with the source of the cold law. In other words, they seemed to originate from the source of the cold law and seemed to be the convergence of the various principles and mysteries of the source of the cold law. However, in reality, there was no direct connection between them and the source of the cold law. At this moment, the many branch meridians originated from this area of the space-time distortion. All the branch meridians seemed to have been born out of thin air. They gathered together and eventually turned into an invisible river that extended beyond this area and into the ice layer. In the end, it meandered and flowed into the entire ice field like a huge network that enveloped the entire ice field. It even formed a strange ice world that gave birth to countless races. However, even if there was no direct connection like the roots and tree trunks, no one could deny that the branch meridians were connected to the source of the cold law. Even if this connection was unusual and different from what ordinary people understood, the existence of this connection could not be denied. To the source of the cold law, the coldness was not its core. The cold air that filled the entire ice field came from the source of the cold law. However, that was just like the source of the heat. Due to various coincidences, the cold aura had fused with the origin of the laws. In the end, the cold aura was strengthened by the origin of the laws, resulting in all sorts of unimaginable effects. In the end, this vast and boundless ice field was formed. For the song itself, the profoundness of the source of the rules wasn't coldness. In fact, the cold air was not really produced by the source of the cold laws. It could be said that if it wasn't cold chi that had appeared here, but a wave of heat instead, then the source of the laws before them would no longer be the source of the cold laws, but the source of the heat laws. Just like the heat law source that Luo Fan had previously obtained, since the origin of the rules had such a special characteristic, the connection between the branch meridians and the origin of the rules naturally didn't need to rely on the connection between the cold air. The connection between the two could be achieved through the nomological laws. Evidently, the rules and laws were omnipresent in every corner of the world. Under such circumstances, the origin of the rules seemed to have no direct connection with the branch meridians, but in essence, they were all attached to the nomological laws. In other words, they were enveloped by the nomological laws that permeated the entire world. In this way, they would naturally be tightly linked to each other through the laws and laws. Luo Fan naturally didn't care about this. In this distortion of space and time, he once again experienced the source of the heat law that he had previously obtained. He tried his best to understand the various principles and profoundness that were closely connected to the source of the cold law. After finding them, he tried his best to shatter them once again and experience them once more. He tried his best to study the principles hidden within and the profound meaning that he hadn't understood before. The reason why those principles and profoundness would go beyond his control and form a connection with some other source of the rules in the outside world was actually very simple. It was because his understanding of those principles and profoundness hadn't been completely thorough. because he hadn't fully understood them, those principles and profoundness were still a whole. At least, a certain part of them was still a whole. In this whole, there was a hidden existence similar to a back door. This kind of back door could be triggered by certain changes in the outside world. In the end, it would go beyond his control and show some uncontrollable characteristic. Under such circumstances, the only way to prevent this kind of uncontrollable appearance was to shatter the whole and discover the existence similar to a back door. As long as he could do this, then all the changes produced by these principles and profoundness would be under his senses and even under his control. At that time, any changes could only be carried out within the scope that he allowed. In this way, the uncontrollable appearance that had just appeared would naturally no longer exist. And this was also what Luo Fan was doing now. At this moment, he was constantly trying to shatter the principles and profoundness that he had previously thought was the end. He was breaking down the deeper mysteries bit by bit and understanding the secrets within. He was trying his best to control the deeper principles and secrets within. As this continued, he felt that his understanding of the heat rule source was getting deeper and deeper. He even gradually discovered many things that he had previously neglected. Perhaps this is a never-ending process. Suddenly, this thought emerged from the bottom of his heart. However, as he continued to understand those principles and profoundness, he discovered that there was a content that far exceeded what he had previously thought. The more he realized that his understanding of those principles and profoundness was shallow, it seemed that these principles and profoundness could even be unearthed endlessly. This understanding corresponded with his current experience. When he had encountered this cold rule source, he hadn't discovered these deep content. It only appeared after he had discovered this cold rule source. In that case, who could guarantee that the changes triggered by the source of the rule of cold were all that was contained within? Perhaps this was only a small part of it? Perhaps what he had discovered now, and what the cold rule source had stirred up, was only an insignificant small part of it. Perhaps, when he had encountered more, bigger, and more mysterious rule sources in the future, they would be able to cause even more changes and even more situations that were beyond his control. However, although he had thought of this, Luo Fan didn't completely give up on the idea of these rule sources. After all, in this process of understanding and unearthing its contents, he was also constantly improving. Every time he unearthed a little bit of content, a little deeper truth and a deeper profoundness, he would take another step forward. This was like obtaining a box that could take out food infinitely. No one would think that the box was abnormal just because it could take out food infinitely. This was fundamentally different from the true sage level principle. The principle of the true sage level could also be understood infinitely and could also be unearthed infinitely. However, that was because it was too profound and profound, far beyond the understanding of those who were below the true divine stage. That was why it was a situation like this. As for the understanding of the principle of this technique, no matter what, one could only get close to it, but not truly obtain it. As such, for cultivators, it was naturally a heavy burden, a burden that they couldn't bear. For existences below the true sage level, there was naturally no need to understand this principle and this profoundness. However, the rule source in front of him was different. The principle and profoundness contained in the rule source itself wasn't something that Luo Fan couldn't understand. As long as he could discover all the principles and profoundness contained in it, he would definitely be able to understand it. Even if it could be unearthed infinitely, even if there was a deeper level to be discovered, no matter how deep one went, that was only because of the structure. It was because it had already used a method that Luo Fan couldn't understand to overlay the principles and profoundness that he could originally understand infinitely. Perhaps the overlaying method was a heavy burden to him, and it was something that he shouldn't have to understand. However, just the principles and profoundness themselves weren't. Obviously, What Luo Fan comprehended were those principles and profoundness. Therefore, to him, the rule source wasn't like the principles or aura of existences at the true sage level. It was a burden that needed to be abandoned and destroyed. Precisely because of this, at this moment, Luo Fan didn't completely abandon the principle just because he realized that it could be unearthed infinitely. Instead, he put in even more effort to understand the principles and profoundness, and unearthed the countless meanings within. As long as I'm not affected by the rule source of the cold, it means that I've already unearthed it to a sufficient depth. At least for now, it's already sufficient depth. As various thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan finally understood what exactly he had to do next. At the same time, his desire to snatch the cold rule source, which was close to greed, had already disappeared. At this moment, he had already made a decision in his heart. He didn't need the cold rule source in front of him. In other words, to him, his original goal of regaining control over the heat rule source that he had already absorbed and digested was to ensure that it would not be affected by the cold rule source. This had become his final goal from being a transit point to a node. The reason for this was naturally because he suddenly understood that the origin of the ice laws was dispensable to him. If the heat rule source could be unearthed infinitely, then the principles and profoundness contained within would actually be limitless. Such principles and profoundness were clearly enough for him to comprehend. In this case, even if he obtained the cold rule source again, the principles and profoundness he obtained would only be a repetition of the previous ones. To him, the benefits would be minimal, and it could even be said that there was no benefit at all. It would only increase his workload. In this case, why would he need to obtain the cold rule source? After dispelling this greed, he suddenly realized that his entire body shook, and the slight feeling of being out of control suddenly skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, it reached a level that was thousands of times stronger than when he had first arrived at the cold rule source. Meanwhile, the many profound truths and mysteries that he had already shattered and comprehended once again suddenly underwent new changes. It was as if some of the internal structures had surfaced and caught his attention. I've done the right thing. At this moment, how could Luo Fan not understand that he had already made the right decision? So, this is how the rule source is used. His view of the rule source had already undergone an earth-shattering change. Originally, he had treated the rule source as food and nutrient. But now, he realized that the rule source was actually just a form of guidance. Any cultivator only needed to obtain one rule source to be considered to have obtained all of it. In the future, he might still need to find other rule source, but that would no longer be absorbing or seizing them. Instead, he would use the new rule source to stimulate the rule source that he had obtained. Through this stimulation, the deeper meaning and profoundness hidden within the rule source would be revealed, allowing the cultivator to comprehend it and absorb the rule's source on a deeper level. And once the new rule's source's stimulation of the original rule's source ended, in other words, the cultivator's absorption of the original rule's source would have improved to the point where he would be immune to the stimulation of the new rule's source. That was when the cultivator would leave this rule source and head to another rule source in search of new stimulation. Chapter 2591. The source of the cold law in front of him was constantly emitting a boundless chill, causing Luo Fan to constantly circulate the heat in his body to withstand it. If he hadn't broken through, he definitely wouldn't be able to stay here for long in such a state. Every once in a while, he would have to leave this icy field and head to other areas to absorb heat to replenish the heat in his body. However, now that he had made a breakthrough, the situation was completely different. After his body broke through, his body had already stepped into the innate Grand Luo realm. The most obvious characteristic of an innate Grand Luo was that they were self-sufficient and didn't rely on external forces. This characteristic allowed the heat in his body to be born out of thin air according to his will. No matter how much he consumed, he could replenish it at any time. In this way, as long as the heat consumption rate wasn't too shocking, he could maintain this consumption rate forever. If it was before Luo Fan understood the true use of the source of the laws, he would have to go against the flow to resist the chill in the outside world. The amount of heat he needed to resist was tens or even hundreds of times more than the usual amount of heat. If that was the case, the rate of consumption would have already surpassed the rate at which his body could recover. If that was the case, he naturally wouldn't be able to hold on for too long. However, after he understood the true use of the source of the laws, a portion of the heat that was emitted from the source of the laws was naturally dispersed by the principles and profundities of the source of the laws. In that case, the amount of heat he needed to resist was reduced to a normal level. In fact, it was even less than the normal level. In that case, the rate of consumption was left behind by the recovery rate. This also meant that from now on, no matter how many years passed, even if it was for eternity, Luo Fan could stay here forever. He didn't need to leave this icy field to replenish his heat in the outside world. As long as he was willing with such a change, staying near the source of the cold law naturally made Luo Fan feel less pressured. In the next 100 years, Luo Fan remained at his original position and didn't move at all as he experienced the source of the law of heat that he had absorbed into his body. Along with the experience of the past 100 years, he was more and more certain that his previous thoughts were correct. The principles and profundities contained in the source of these laws were indeed limitless. In the past 100 years, he felt that he had already dug a few hundred or even a few thousand levels into those principles and mysteries. However, even after digging to such a deep level, he still felt that there were countless layers hidden within. Behind it, within the principles and mysteries of the microscopic level that he had already deepened to the point where it was incomparably insignificant, to the point where even his perception could not reach, there were still more and more complicated levels hidden. As for why he could comprehend and dig deeper into the microscopic level that his senses could not reach, the reason was very simple. However, it was precisely because, at this moment, in front of him, was the source of the law of ice, which was already much closer to him. Due to the existence of the law of cold, the microscopic details were extremely active. This kind of activity caused these microscopic details to stand out from the endless microscopic bodies, and also caused the changes within them to be even more obvious. In the end, these microscopic bodies could be comprehended by him, and he could continue to shatter and absorb them. As for why he was now closer to the source of the law of cold than 100 years ago, it was even simpler. This was because the closer he was to the source of the law of cold, the greater the stimulation of the law of heat in his body. In the past 100 years, every few years, Luo Fan would feel that his research on the source of the law of heat had reached a certain limit. At this distance, the stimulation of the law of cold on the source of the law of heat had already reached its limit. If he did not get closer to the source of the law of cold, there would no longer be any meaning in staying here hence. He had no choice but to continue moving forward and get closer to the source of the law of cold. Just like this, he would get closer to the source of the law of cold every few years. Now, he was almost close to the source of the law of cold. However, the closer he got to the source of the law of cold, the coldness also became stronger. The consumption of the heat in his body also became greater. If it was not for the fact that his absorption of the source of the law of heat had strengthened, causing his body to advance to the innate Grand Luo level, and the amount of heat that his body could recover over time, the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat in his body would have been completely broken. If that was the case, he would have to find a time to leave this ice field and head to other places with heat to absorb heat to recover his body's consumption. However, although there was only a thin line between the source of the law of cold and the source of the law of cold, the coldness between the two was on two different levels. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was almost close to the source of the law of cold, could maintain the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat in his body, but it did not mean that he could still maintain the balance after entering the source of the law of cold. Hence, at this moment, Luo Fan did not feel that the stimulation of the law of cold on the source of the law of heat in his body was no longer effective. Instead, he directly stepped into the source of the law of cold. Instead, he was prepared to wait here for a period of time. At the very least, he had to accumulate enough heat in his body so that his body could last longer when the balance between the consumption and recovery of heat was broken. Staying here and waiting for the heat to accumulate bit by bit was naturally much faster than leaving this ice field and looking for a place like a volcano to absorb heat. After all, although his body could generate heat out of thin air as he willed, the heat that was generated still had to be eroded by the cold outside, and was constantly being consumed. In fact, the speed at which the heat was generated was only slightly faster than the speed at which it was consumed. In this way, the time needed to accumulate the same amount of heat would probably be thousands or even tens of thousands of times slower than the outside world. However, there was an advantage to accumulating heat here. That was, the source of the law of cold still stimulated the source of the law of heat in his body to a certain extent. This stimulation was not enough for him to dig deeper into the source of the law of heat, and to dig deeper truths and mysteries. However, it was enough for him to absorb the many truths and mysteries that he had dug out before. Absorbing and comprehending was not a one-time process. It was just like when Luo Fan had just stepped into the source of the law of cold. He immediately discovered that his body was faintly affected by the source of the law of cold, and everything that he had cultivated was faintly controlled by the source of the law of cold. At this time, Luo Fan did not dare to guarantee that he would not suffer the same fate when he encountered another source of the law of cold that was even more powerful and vast than the source of the law of cold. Therefore, at this time, he had to obediently absorb the various truths and mysteries that he had dug out before and turn them into nutrients for the growth of his worldview, his body, and his heat. Only then would he be able to avoid the predicament of encountering the source of the cold law. Of course, only by doing this could he truly absorb a part of the source of the law of heat and make it his own. If my cultivation realm recovers at this time, the great calamity will probably be greatly brought forward. Occasionally, such a thought would flash across Luo Fan's mind. This land of opportunity had a wonderful use. That was to suppress the great calamity. The great calamity that Luo Fan encountered was a kind of calamity that was born from the state of chaos because of his cultivation. The existence of this kind of calamity would constantly be brought forward as his cultivation realm increased. If he comprehended something that allowed his cultivation realm to increase beyond the limit, then even if the great calamity that he had originally sensed would arrive billions of years later, the great calamity might instantly arrive in the next moment. And obviously, for Luo Fan, the increase of his cultivation realm was actually closely related to the increase of his worldview. The increase of his worldview could very easily be converted into the increase of his cultivation realm. And the increase of his cultivation realm could also be converted into the sublimation of his worldview through some complicated changes. The two could almost be said to be 1 and 2, 2 and 1. And now, with the opportunity that he had obtained in this world, his worldview had already made great progress compared to 100 years ago. He didn't dare to say that he had improved by a level, but at least he had taken a huge step forward from his original level. Under such circumstances, if this was converted into the increase of his cultivation realm, the increase of his cultivation realm in the past 100 years would definitely be enough to greatly accelerate his seventh great calamity. Perhaps the original 300 million years of time would be directly surpassed by this increase, causing his seventh great calamity to descend in the next instant. But, apparently, that did not happen. The suppression of this world on transcendence and the suppression of the strength that he could unleash seemed to have affected the great calamity. In other words, during this suppression process, the great calamity's perception of him seemed to have weakened. This weakening made it so that no matter how much his view of the world had improved, no matter how much his cultivation had improved, the seventh great tribulation had completely ignored him. In the eyes of the seventh great calamity, he was still the same person that had stepped into this land of opportunity over 100 years ago. No matter how much he improved, the great calamity would not be brought forward because of this. At the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan felt that his seventh great calamity had only been reduced by a little over 100 years compared to the original. This was not much different from the time that he had entered this world. This situation for Luo Fan was a rare good thing. It could be said that this alone was enough for Luo Fan to put in so much effort to enter this land of opportunity. This way, I can also improve myself at will, and I don't need to worry about the great calamity being brought forward if I improve too much. This thought flashed through his mind, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Improving himself and the arrival of the great calamity, this was a contradiction. If he didn't improve himself, he wouldn't have much confidence in facing the great calamity. But once he improved himself, the great calamity would come forward, which in turn reduced the preparation time. The pros and cons could only be determined by the cultivator himself. In the past, Luo Fan didn't care about this at all. He only focused on improving himself, and wholeheartedly focused on improving his cultivation realm as much as possible before the great calamity came. This method allowed him to improve to his current level in an extremely short period of time. One must know that under normal cultivators' cultivation, any cultivator who wanted to cultivate to Luo Fan's level would need at least 1 billion times more time than Luo Fan. Of course, this was because Luo Fan's path was different from theirs. However, it was obvious that the method that Luo Fan used to face the great calamity was also an important reason. It was precisely because Luo Fan didn't care about the time or the early arrival of the great calamity. He only focused on improving himself, and he was even happy because of the acceleration of time. That was why he was able to cultivate to his current level in such a short period of time. It was obvious that with his cultivation speed, his speed would still be many times faster than ordinary cultivators. At the very least, he didn't think that he would be stuck at the seventh tribulation like Taoist Wui and the others, who would need to spend billions of years to reach this level. However, this didn't mean that Luo Fan liked the feeling of having something constantly urging him behind his back. It was because he couldn't think of anything at all. After all, Luo Fan was a normal living being, a normal cultivator, and not a monster. Being able to relax and have a period of stability was something that he liked in the end. Chapter 2592. In this area, the absolute suppression of this land had also blinded the state of chaos. In this process of suppression, all his progress in the state of chaos was overshadowed by the state he was in before he entered this place. In other words, in the state of chaos, the current him was actually in a state where he was suppressed by this place. In other words, in the state of chaos, the current him was only a grand heavenly realm cultivator. This realm was naturally far from the state he was in before he entered this place, when he was at the peak of the sixth tribulation. In this way, any progress he made in this place would only strengthen his foundation at a lower level in the state of chaos. It wouldn't affect his upper limit at all, and naturally wouldn't bring forward the seventh tribulation that he would encounter. In this way, he would obviously have more time to strengthen himself and improve himself. Luo Fan stayed outside the source of the law of cold for 1,000 years. Previously, in order to feel the stimulation from the source of the law of cold for absorbing the law of heat, he only spent 100 years. But this time, in order to relive everything from before, he had spent 10 times more time than before. For Luo Fan, who would encounter the seventh tribulation in 300 million years, even 1,000 years was quite precious. Spending 1,000 years here seemed like a waste of time, and he didn't use this period of time as motivation to improve his cultivation realm. However, for Luo Fan, He didn't feel that this period of time was a waste. In his heart, he firmly believed that it was worth it to spend 1,000 years here. In fact, it could even be necessary. I've finally gotten rid of some of my impetuousness. On this day, Luo Fan thought to himself as he slowly stepped towards the source of the law of cold. After 1,000 years, the heat that he had accumulated had reached a level that he believed was enough to enter the source of the law of cold. At this moment, in his body, in the heat circulation system, endless heat flowed around his body like a solid object. At every moment, various existences were produced from the depths of his body out of nowhere and continued to fuse with the heat. In fact, his worldview was also constantly fusing with his heat energy, allowing his heat energy to increase and sublimate at every moment, pushing his body to a higher level. The moment he came into contact with the source of the law of cold, an unimaginable chill came from his hand and instantly engulfed his entire body, causing his body to be completely frozen in an instant. His entire body was frozen in the ice. If it was an ordinary cultivator facing this change, even if they didn't die, they would still lose a layer of skin. However, for Luo Fan, who was already prepared, such a chill wasn't enough to move him. At this moment, there wasn't even any change in his expression because of this. Just the natural surge of heat in his body had completely vaporized the surrounding ice, allowing his body to quickly return to its original state. The chill was endless, and the heat in Luo Fan's body was endless as well, constantly fighting against the chill. At this moment, he clearly felt that the source of the law of heat in his body had received an intense stimulation that it had never experienced before. The microscopic individual that had been separated to the limits of his senses now revealed its existence in an unprecedented manner, allowing Luo Fan to clearly discover its existence even if he didn't focus. As expected, the stimulation is many times stronger than before. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he no longer hesitated and took a step forward, completely stepping into the source of the law of cold. As he stepped in, the source of the law of cold started to tremble slightly, and circles of ripples were continuously released on its surface. The source of the law of cold was the source of the entire ice field. Even though the source of the law of cold itself didn't have much to do with the cold, because of its combination with the chill here, it naturally increased the chill, causing it to become the source of the entire ice field. Under such circumstances, the source of the law of cold had a huge impact, but it didn't just affect the source itself. Instead, it spread out and directly affected the entire ice field, causing the entire ice field to undergo an earth-shattering change in an instant. At this moment, cracking sounds could be heard from all over the ice field. Countless cracks seemed to suddenly appear in the ice field out of nowhere, but they quickly closed up due to the chill in the ice field. This change made the originally extremely calm ice field seem to instantly become noisy and lively. It felt like the entire ice field was a living creature that was currently in a deep sleep and was currently turning over. However, this was the extent of the changes to the entire ice field. After all, apart from the cold ice, there was actually nothing else in the ice field. Under such circumstances, as long as the changes to the ice field didn't cause the entire ice field to collapse and shrink or expand, the changes to the ice field wouldn't cause too much of an impact. Therefore, even though the ice field trembled a few times and rattling sounds echoed throughout the ice field, that was all there was to it. However, there weren't any obvious changes in the outside world because of this. In fact, if one was a little further away, they wouldn't even be able to sense the changes. However, this was only in the outside world. To the inside of the ice field, the impact of this change was earth-shattering. It should be known that the ice field seemed to be empty at first glance, with only the existence of the cold. However, in reality, due to the influence of the source of the law of cold, there were many strange living creatures in the ice field. These living creatures viewed the entire ice field from a completely different perspective from ordinary living creatures. To them, the ice field was their universe, it was their world, it was their land, and it was their spacetime. At this moment, the continuous cracking and mending of the ice field appeared everywhere. To them, it was as if the myriad of worlds had started to undergo shocking changes. The world was cracking, the earth was dying and being born again, the universe was shifting, and the starry sky was changing shape. Everything made them feel as if the entire world was becoming completely different from before at every single moment. Due to these changes, countless living creatures had perished on the first day, and countless worlds that ordinary living creatures were familiar with had disappeared without a trace. However, at the same time, countless strange living creatures were born out of thin air. There were also countless strange worlds that were born out of thin air. These various changes even made the knowledgeable living creatures wonder if the original development of billions of years had been compressed into a few days. That's right, some knowledgeable living creatures had already appeared in the various worlds within the ice field. Ever since the living creatures that had chased after Luo Fan and headed towards the source of the law of cold returned to those worlds, these living creatures had already been born. Back then, those living creatures had chased after Luo Fan and continuously ventured deeper into the ice field, continuously approaching the source of the law of cold. In the end, due to various factors, whether inevitable or accidental, some sort of barrier over their hearts was removed, allowing them to obtain true intelligence, and from then on, they became truly intelligent living creatures. However, at the same time, they had also lost track of Luo Fan, and no longer knew where to continue chasing after Luo Fan deep into the ice field. Thus, after that, they had all returned to their own ice worlds. After returning to those worlds, due to some extremely mysterious mechanism, the intelligence they obtained began to gradually influence more and more other living creatures. This allowed those living creatures that were already on the verge of developing true intelligence to truly open the final barrier and obtain true intelligence. As this intelligence was obtained, the battles between the various worlds, or perhaps the various races, naturally weakened a lot. After all, the original reason why the battles were so intense was actually because the living creatures that participated in the battles were controlled by their instincts. After obtaining true intelligence, although their instincts did not disappear, they could already be suppressed by intelligence and rationality. With this suppression, they would naturally weigh the pros and cons of the battles, and would naturally weigh whether it was necessary for them to fight, and to what extent they could accept it. With this consideration, the scale of the battles naturally began to change. After the scale of the battles changed, those worlds naturally had more time and more opportunities to develop. In the end, in the thousands of years that Luo Fan saw, and in the hundreds of thousands of years that they saw, they had already completely changed the situation of those worlds, allowing those so-called worlds to truly have the taste of a world, and also allowing those worlds to give birth to real civilizations. It was precisely because of this that when faced with the current disaster, those worlds' performance was much better than expected. At the very least, it was much better than when the disasters happened in the past. Although this kind of disaster did not happen often, the icy plains had existed for countless years, and changes were bound to happen. Once the icy plains changed, for the living creatures that lived in the icy plains, it was equivalent to a change in the infinite worlds, and the impact would definitely not be much less than this time. In the past, almost every time the icy plains changed, it would be enough to cause a great collapse of the living creatures. Every time, the original embryonic civilization would be destroyed, and it would be completely unsalvageable. After all, in the past, those living creatures were more controlled by instincts. They would not measure how the changes would affect their future, they only knew that they would be fine, but their enemies would almost die. Therefore, they would choose to directly attack their enemies, making things worse for them, and die a violent death. After that, when they were about to die, other living creatures would naturally treat them as targets, and directly attack them. In this endless cycle, the vast majority of living beings would die within it in the end. If almost all living creatures were dead, how could there be any embryonic civilization? But now, the situation was completely different. Living creatures with intelligence and civilization would naturally measure the scale of the changes, and would naturally consider how they could maintain their own civilization as much as possible. Therefore, things like helping each other, which would have been impossible in the past, would naturally appear between these civilizations. Once they helped each other, the possibility of a civilization being able to continue would naturally increase greatly. One day, a living creature that had chased after Luo Fan towards the origin of the laws of frost made this judgment. The changes this time are very different from before. It feels more like a new race is being born. This living creature was the first among the living creatures in the icy plains to gain intelligence, and could be said to be the so-called ancestors of wisdom in the infinite worlds. As such, he naturally had an extremely transcendent status. Because they were from the same batch of people who had gained wisdom, they no longer hated their mortal enemies. Instead, their relationship with each other was in a rather complicated state. They were repelling each other, but also friendly at the same time. At this moment, his words were directed to the ancestors of wisdom in other worlds through the icy plains. Very similar. Moreover, I sensed a rather familiar aura from it. Another ancestor of wisdom responded at this moment. You sensed it too? I thought it was just my imagination, another ancestor of wisdom said. His voice was filled with shock and disbelief, as if what he had just heard was inconceivable to him as well. If even the two of you feel this way, then it's almost certain. This change must have been caused by that foreign object. Another ancestor of wisdom made his judgment at this moment. That should be the case. The other progenitors of wisdom all agreed. To these ancestors of wisdom, in the infinite worlds, they were the only existences that could communicate with each other. To them, all other living creatures were merely juniors. To them, they were far, far too stupid. Therefore, they communicated with each other in this manner, and made decisions together regarding important matters in the infinite world. Naturally, there were all sorts of schemes and all sorts of battles. There was no need to mention them. To a certain extent, this kind of communication. Chapter 2593. Following the actions of the wisdom ancestors, the entire ice field began to squirm. The terrifying changes that had been suppressed reappeared at this moment. However, the terrifying power seemed to be guided by some unimaginable existence. Although it was still causing all sorts of destruction to those worlds, at the same time, it was also pushing those worlds to converge towards the center. These worlds were formed because of the many branches that extended from the source of the cold rule. The changes in these worlds would naturally affect those branches. At this moment, with the push of the changes, those worlds began to converge towards a certain center. However, it also gradually affected those branches that had originally extended in all directions. As a result, those branches also began to change directions and began to converge towards the center along with those worlds. Compared to the changes in the original myriad heavens and realms, this change was quite huge. The changes in the worlds could be said to be changes in the perspective of those living beings. For the ice field in reality, this was at most a slight change in the circulation of the cold air. However, at this moment, the changes caused by these branches were unbelievably huge. It should be known that these branches were like the entire ice field. They were extended from the source of the cold rule. In this way, the changes in these branches could be said to be the changes in the entire ice field. Along with this change, all the ice in the entire ice field seemed to have begun to flow. An unknown amount of terrifying power was continuously accumulating, releasing, accumulating, and releasing. In the end, a strange rumbling sound came from the entire ice field. Even the originally calm surface of the ice field began to undulate strangely. Amidst these strange undulations, the ice in the ice field splashed everywhere. icebergs even rose from the ice field, and basins suddenly appeared. It was as if there was an invisible hand that was casually reshaping the entire ice field. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan, who was in the depths of the ice field, didn't feel anything. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly experiencing the stimulation of the source of the cold rule on the source of the heat rule in his body. He felt more and more details of the source of the cold rule in his body that he couldn't sense before resurfacing in the corner of his attention. It displayed an increasingly strong sense of existence in front of him. It displayed all sorts of mysterious principles and mysteries without reservation, allowing him to shatter it bit by bit and fuse it into his worldview, into his body, and into the heat in his body. At this time, in the heat cycle in his body, there was an endless amount of heat being rapidly consumed at every moment. But even so, his body still felt waves of cold. But even with such a large amount of energy consumed, he still couldn't completely block the boundless chill that was being released from the source of the law of ice. His entire body trembled under the chill, and he couldn't help using his instincts to resist the chill. Fortunately, he had accumulated enough heat in the past 1,000 years, and he was able to completely resist this pressure. Otherwise, just the pressure formed by this kind of cold would have been enough to tie up all of his mental strength. At that time, how would he still have the mood to comprehend the various principles and mysteries that he had previously ignored that had resurfaced in the source of the heat rule? But even so, he felt that his efficiency in comprehending those principles and mysteries had greatly decreased. Although his comprehension efficiency was much higher than when he was outside at the last moment, it was still many times worse than when he first sensed the stimulation of the source of the cold rule. Luo Fan was naturally dissatisfied with this situation. But it was obvious that this wasn't something he could change. Cultivation had its own rules. At a low level, as long as one comprehended a little, there would be a huge improvement and earth-shattering changes. However, the higher one cultivated, the slower one's cultivation speed would be. As time passed and one's level increased, one would encounter a bottleneck after reaching a certain level. No matter how one cultivated, one would not be able to improve further. And now, Luo Fan had clearly fallen into a state where his cultivation speed had slowed down. This kind of situation was much slower than before, but it was still many times better than the state of being stuck in a bottleneck. Therefore, even if he wasn't satisfied with this cultivation speed, he could only obediently accept it. Now all he could do was patiently wait, patiently cultivate, and rely on his spirit to absorb the benefits brought by the stimulation bit by bit. For Luo Fan, he had already fallen into a peaceful state of cultivation for a long time. Everything else had nothing to do with him. However, for the living beings in the ice field, the world would undergo drastic changes. The world would find its balance again, and it would be the juncture where the worlds would be destroyed and reborn. If they could withstand it, then the worlds would welcome a new life. If they couldn't, then all the worlds in the universe would perish. All the civilizations and living beings in the universe, even the ancestors of wisdom, would perish as a result. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestors were naturally extremely careful. In fact, he was already faintly becoming anxious. They had already guessed that it would be extremely difficult to unify the worlds and reform them into a complete world. However, when they actually carried out the task, they realized that it was not just difficult at all. It was an almost impossible task. Before this, they were worried that the other wisdom ancestors would take advantage of this opportunity to harm them. But when they actually carried out the task, they realized that they were just worrying for nothing. At this juncture where the worlds would be destroyed and all living beings and civilizations would perish, how antisocial would they have to be to plot against their companions? It must be known that this wasn't just the deaths of others, but their own deaths. They were confident that the enmity and conflict between them and the others had not reached the point where they had to perish together with them. Therefore, it could be said that they understood that their next enemy was actually the power that was obstructing the convergence of the worlds, and not the other ancestors of wisdom. Origin energy is indeed violent. If we hadn't comprehended many of its profundities over the years, I'm afraid that the worlds would have perished by now, one of the wisdom ancestors said with difficulty. Don't be distracted at this time, another wisdom ancestor said. Following that, the wisdom ancestor who spoke first said, "This isn't being distracted. This is unifying our thoughts." The other wisdom ancestors only faintly smiled and did not reply to his words. They also knew the wisdom ancestor's intentions, but they didn't agree with it. The wisdom ancestor clearly wanted to make sure that everyone else had the same thoughts as him, so he clearly explained the risks of the plan that they were carrying out. But to the other wisdom ancestors, there was no need to say anything at all. At this time, they no longer had any thoughts of being on guard against others, nor did they have any thoughts of dealing with others. They believed that virtually all of the wisdom ancestors knew this attitude. Their way of thinking and their views would be the same. Under such circumstances, the wisdom ancestor said these words in order to unify everyone's thoughts and confirm that everyone had the same thoughts as him. This obviously meant that he himself was actually the one who didn't trust others the most. In other words, he still held a certain level of vigilance towards others. Because of this, they naturally didn't have any thoughts of paying attention to the wisdom ancestor who was so suspicious. If it wasn't for the fact that the situation was too grim and the worlds might perish if they weren't careful, the wisdom ancestor might have already started to look down on him. The wisdom ancestor didn't care about the attitudes of the other wisdom ancestors at all. He was already able to confirm his thoughts from the attitudes of the other wisdom ancestors and knew their mentality. He understood that he no longer needed to be on guard against the other wisdom ancestors. As he realized this, he was finally able to wholeheartedly devote himself to the promotion of the myriad heavens realms. A few days ago, the wisdom ancestor had also started to put in effort during this process and had also started to pour all of his attention into it. As they changed, the movement of the worlds became more and more stable, and the number of worlds that perished due to the movement also started to decrease. From a certain point of view, the words of the wisdom ancestor had actually achieved his goal. If it hadn't been for these words, it would have taken some time for them to unify their thoughts. If that was the case, there might be several worlds in the universe that would perish because of this. While the wisdom ancestors were constantly pushing the multiverse world, all sorts of changes were taking place outside the multiverse world. Outside of the myriad heavens and realms was still within the scope of the tundra ice field. In other words, it meant that there was another area within the ice field that was different from the worlds outside. One world after another was gradually forming in that region. Or rather, it couldn't be said to be a single area, but rather a large area. That area was like a halo that enveloped all the worlds in the universe. As the worlds in the universe shrank, it began to expand. What's going on? The wisdom ancestors were all indescribably shocked when they sensed this. Exclamations of bewilderment and bewilderment rang out from all over the worlds, reverberating in everyone's ears. These worlds aren't our worlds. At this moment, another wisdom ancestor with sharper senses said with an ugly expression on his face, "That's right, I can't control those worlds at all. Even my perception can't penetrate those worlds." Another wisdom ancestor said in an extremely solemn voice, "I've sensed a little more." At this moment, another wisdom ancestor spoke up. When the other wisdom ancestors heard this, their expressions changed slightly, and they all asked him what he had sensed. The otherworldly alternate entity. I sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity within it. The wisdom ancestor didn't keep them in suspense, and at this moment, he directly told them what he had sensed. These words contained an incomparably heavy and shocked emotion. Hearing this voice, one could instantly understand how heavy and shocked the person who spoke was at this moment. The otherworldly alternate entity. Are you sure you didn't sense wrongly? The other wisdom ancestors all exclaimed at this moment. Although they had already sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity when the ice field had changed previously, at that time, they had only thought that the otherworldly alternate entity was using some method to destroy the ice field, or perhaps, to destroy the source of the world. However, at this moment, they actually sensed the aura of the otherworldly alternate entity in the newly born world. Didn't this mean that the otherworldly alternate entity wasn't just destroying things? Could it be that he wanted to replace all the heavens and myriad realms and make them his? At this moment, horrifying thoughts appeared in the hearts of all the wisdom ancestors, causing their expressions to become even more unsightly. To them, this world was only as big as the myriad heavens and realms. To them, everything outside the ice field was in a state of chaos, just like to Luofan. Under such circumstances, their gazes were naturally limited to this area. To them, the myriad worlds were everything, and its preciousness could suppress everything they knew. In this way, the otherworldly alternate entity wanted to turn everything into its own. It wanted to take everything for itself, which was why they were so shocked. Amidst this shock, they even relaxed their control over the otherworldly alternate entity. Just that one moment of relaxation had caused thousands of worlds to perish. Chapter 2594. No matter what the other party wants to do, protecting our people and protecting our civilization is our most important mission. We'll talk about everything else when we're free. One of the wisdom ancestors shouted. Following this shout, the other wisdom progenitors responded in unison. This wasn't because they felt that the wisdom ancestor who had shouted had a higher status than them, but because they agreed with what the wisdom ancestor had said. Although their current intelligence had surpassed that of their people and all living beings in their civilization, they were still far more intelligent than them. However, their roots were still in the clansmen that they were superior to. If it weren't for them, these wisdom ancestors would only be relatively powerful ordinary living beings in this universe. How could they be called Tao ancestors? Moreover, without their roots, they would become isolated people. They would lose their homes and motivation, and it would be normal for them to become wandering ghosts. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't let this happen. But his feelings for his people and his civilization were extremely passionate and intense. This was especially so now because of their mistakes. They had caused many worlds to collapse, many civilizations to be destroyed, and many living beings to perish. This sense of guilt caused the emotions hidden in the depths of their hearts to surface once again. They began to occupy their minds, causing them to become emotional. It was precisely because of this that they agreed so solemnly. However, the wisdom ancestor who shouted did not feel proud because of this. At this time, he was also extremely solemn. Those words weren't only said to the other wisdom ancestors, but also to himself. These words were also to remind himself not to forget his roots, not to forget his dependence, and not to forget his feelings. With such a mentality, how could he be complacent because of the stern reply of the other wisdom ancestors? As the many wisdom ancestors shifted their attention from the outside world, the universe stabilized again and began to slowly shrink inward like before. They slowly approached each other and gradually glued together. Outside of the multiverse, in another region of the ice field, countless tiny worlds were born and gradually replaced the original multiverse. They gradually occupied the region where the original multiverse was and filled those regions with worlds, causing the situation in the ice field to be the same as before. Faced with this situation, although the wisdom ancestors noticed it, they had already made up their minds, so they no longer cared about the changes in the situation. At this moment, even if the many worlds in the outside world continued to be born and occupied the area they gave up, they only focused on pushing the universe that they could influence. They focused on controlling the source power that filled the universe, which was like the source power of the universe, and constantly pushed the universe toward the center. Under this change, the living beings in the universe suddenly felt that the world seemed to have become stable again. Moreover, the doomsday-like danger that permeated their hearts had completely disappeared at this moment. What replaced it was an indescribable sense of warmth and stability. It was as if some incomparably huge and mighty existence was embracing them with its chest, giving them enough warmth and enough safety. That feeling made all the living beings feel satisfied, and it was to the point that the chaos caused by the changes from before had unknowingly calmed down. Outside the multiverse, the worlds that had filled up the space that the multiverse had made way for continued to fill up those areas and began to communicate with each other. Vaguely, they also began to communicate with the tundra. Gradually, they absorbed all sorts of indescribable things from the tundra. Gradually, these worlds began to grow, and vaguely, they began to connect as one, displaying some sort of extraordinary unity. Unknowingly, many living beings were born in these worlds. These living beings that were born from those worlds were extremely mysterious. Within those living beings, one could sense an aura that belonged to the universe, as well as an aura that belonged to the otherworldly oddity. Moreover, the aura of the universe was not limited to the aura of the living beings in the civilizations that were born under the influence of any of the branches. Instead, it included the aura of the living beings in the civilizations that were born under the influence of all the branches in the universe. It felt like these countless worlds were born from the fusion of the myriad heavens and realms, and then fused with a certain existence brought by the otherworldly alternate entity. At this moment, the branches began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. It was originally like the convergence of a river, but at this moment there were wisps of thin branches that were born from the branches. Like a network, they communicated with each other and formed one, enveloping the many worlds outside. During this process, the aura belonging to the otherworldly oddities in those worlds also began to move. They began to automatically guide the branch veins, taking advantage of the branch veins to continuously absorb, and gather. At this moment, the branch veins seemed to have become the source of power. They began to continuously inject energy into those worlds, causing them to continuously grow and sublimate. In the end, they became more and more powerful, larger and larger, and the creatures within them also became more and more complex and numerous. In the end, there were even signs of them forming a civilization. Compared to the myriad worlds in the universe that needed the wisdom ancestor to light up its wisdom and let it spread, the living beings in these newly born worlds were naturally polarized. Those that possessed wisdom had seeds of wisdom from the beginning, and did not need the wisdom ancestor to light them up and spread their wisdom. As they grew, they would naturally be able to possess perfect and even powerful wisdom. On the other hand, most of the living beings were born without the seeds of wisdom. No matter how they grew and sublimated, they could only evolve at the level without wisdom. Under this polarized situation, those worlds were extremely lively. Those without wisdom naturally rejected those with the seeds of wisdom. Although they did not have wisdom, they had instincts and intuitions. This instinct and intuition caused them to abhor those who possessed the seeds of wisdom and could grow into intelligent beings or even create civilizations. Once they sensed their existence, they would pounce on them and fight them to the death. They were even willing to perish together in order to kill them. In the face of such a situation, those with the seeds of wisdom felt unimaginable pressure. This pressure made them use all means to sublimate themselves, improve themselves, and evolve themselves. Under such circumstances, they began to rapidly mature, and the seeds of wisdom hidden in their bodies began to grow and strengthen at an unimaginable speed. As they grew and strengthened, those living beings became smarter and smarter. As they became smarter, they naturally turned from a disadvantage to an advantage over those without the seeds of wisdom, and their original defensive stance turned into an offensive stance. Those without the seeds of wisdom gradually became the hunting targets of those who had already become intelligent beings, and they became resources for their growth. Just like that, the embryonic form of civilization began to appear. Due to the existence of those living beings without the seeds of wisdom as external enemies, the embryonic form of civilization endured unimaginable pressure as soon as it appeared, and it grew at an unimaginable speed. In just a few dozen days in the outside world, but in the eyes of the living beings in those worlds within the ice plains, after thousands of years, the embryonic form of civilization in those worlds finally fully matured and became true civilizations. With the emergence of true civilizations, the potential of those living beings in those worlds began to increase at an unimaginable speed. Those worlds that were originally separated also began to connect at an unimaginable speed. As they connected, a new universe appeared in the minds of those living beings. Compared to the previous universe, it was clear that this new universe was more suitable for the living beings in the worlds that had been affected by the otherworldly organisms. Those creatures could sense endless principles and profundities within it. There was also a hint of coldness that transcended the myriad worlds in the universe. In this way, for those living beings, expansion was the only thing they could do. After all, the more they expanded, the more resources they could obtain, and the richer the principles and mysteries they could obtain would be. In this way, how could those living beings who had already tasted this benefit give up on it? In this way, a new war broke out. Compared to the old war between the universes in the past, with the guidance of the ancestor of wisdom, the scale of the war did not exceed the limits of the world. This new universe did not have the existence of such a transcendent ancestor of wisdom. All actions could only be decided by the numerous living beings in the new heavens and realms themselves. For these living beings, their thirst for resources, their thirst for principles and mysteries, was not something that ordinary living beings could compare to. At the very least, it was not something that the living beings in the old universe could compare to. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine what the war caused by those living beings would be like. Unknowingly, the worlds had entered a state of war. Moreover, from time to time, there would be worlds that would be destroyed, shattered, and perished because of this war. If it weren't for the fact that the ice field was still changing at every moment, with countless worlds being born at every moment to make up for the gap formed after the old worlds gave way to the ice field wouldn't have been able to withstand the changes. Otherwise, a war of this scale would have wiped out all the worlds in the ice field in just a few months. Not only would it include the new universes, but it might even include all the living beings and existences in the old universes. If that was the case, the entire ice field would have fallen into a state of deathly stillness. But, even so, the wisdom ancestors were still trembling with fear as they watched this scene. Although the wisdom ancestors were wholeheartedly pushing the old universes, wanting them to completely merge and become one, the changes in the outside world, with so many worlds constantly being born and dying, how could they not care? How could they not know? Therefore, when those worlds fell into war, they had already diverted some of their attention to the new universes. And when they clearly saw how the war in the new universes was carried out, they began to be shocked again and again. The living beings in the new universes did not have existences like the wisdom ancestor to guide them. Therefore, their cultivation methods, in comparison, had many weaknesses, flaws, and crudeness. Purely in terms of perfection, their cultivation methods were actually far inferior to the living beings in the old universes that were guided by the wisdom ancestor. However, this kind of relatively bad thing could actually be regarded as a good thing, apart from anything else. Because they were no longer restricted by the wisdom ancestor, their cultivation methods were like 100 schools of thought contending for supremacy. Almost every cultivation method, every possible cultivation train of thought, could be found in the new myriad heavens and realms. Moreover, because there were no restrictions and guidance from the wisdom ancestor, the destructive power that they developed was even more bizarre. Killing seemed to be the most ordinary method to destroy the enemy in the new universes. Apart from that, there were all sorts of methods that even the wisdom ancestor could not help but tremble at the sight of, such as eliminating one's sense of existence, reversing cause and effect, turning enemies into friends, distorting minds, and so on. In this way, in the eyes of the wisdom ancestors, the new universes were simply a world of monsters. Chapter 2595. The development speed of the new multiverse was rather fast. Battles gave the new multiverse a powerful impetus, causing the living beings to put all their wisdom and thoughts into developing themselves and their own world. In the end, the survival of the fittest in the battles allowed the civilizations of those worlds to constantly sublimate and improve, and it also led the other worlds to continuously sublimate and improve. There were naturally victories and defeats in battles. The victorious ones absorbed the resources of other worlds, nurtured themselves, and allowed their own worlds to constantly grow. However, those who failed didn't just fall into the mud. Failure was a kind of experience, and in a broad sense, it could even be considered a kind of wealth. Under such circumstances, the defeated worlds didn't just fall into despair. Instead, they turned their grief and indignation into strength, gathering the power of the world, and worked hard to cultivate and strengthen themselves in order to be able to turn the tables in the next battle and reverse the fate of failure. In this way, although the speed of development was much slower than the victorious worlds, it was still constantly moving forward and climbing to a higher level. Under such circumstances, the worlds constantly transitioned and constantly sublimated. Perhaps this speed of development was ordinary for the living beings in the new multiverse, and many living beings were even rather dissatisfied with this development. However, for the ancestors of wisdom in the old multiverse, this speed was already extremely terrifying. Each and every one of them was dumbfounded and terrified. They were terrified of this unimaginable speed of development, and they were terrified of when they would discover the old heavens and realms and reach into the old heavens and realms. With this speed of development, the new multiverse had developed all sorts of cultivation methods and unbelievable battle technique. Their worlds simply couldn't resist at all. It was the same even if they, the forefathers of wisdom, existed in the old heavens and the myriad of worlds. Not to mention that they, the ancestors of wisdom, couldn't spare a hand at all. They needed to constantly exert all their efforts to maintain the oppression and pressure on the new multiverse to prevent these worlds from rebounding again. If they were to be discovered by the rebounding forces, then the rebounding force alone would be enough to destroy more than half of the old multiverse. Not to mention, the worlds that were bounced back would directly collide with the new heavens and realms. At that time, just the collision alone would be enough to destroy more than half of the remaining world. In the end, even the most arrogant ancestor of wisdom would never think of using the little bit of the world that was left to deal with the entire new universe. Under such circumstances, they could only pray that the new beings in the multiverse didn't discover them. No one knew if their prayers worked or if there were other reasons. The living beings in the new heavens and realms only focused their attention on the numerous worlds within the new heavens and realms. He didn't seem to have much interest in the outside world. Or perhaps they didn't even know that there were other heavens and realms outside of their own. Faced with this situation, the wisdom ancestors naturally heaved a sigh of relief. However, it was impossible for him to let his guard down. They were only trying their best to speed up the fusion process. As long as they fused, the other benefits were secondary. The most important thing was that they would be able to free up their hands to deal with the threat of the new multiverse. Amidst this uneasiness and worry, the distance between the old multiverse began to shrink gradually. In the end, after thousands of years, the collision finally occurred. In other words, the distance between the many worlds in the old multiverse had finally shrunk to the point where some worlds began to come into contact with each other. Boom, 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 boom. Strange rumbles instantly spread to every corner of the old heavens and realms, causing all living beings to look in all directions towards the source of the rumbles. In other words, they were looking at the place where the worlds in the old multiverse came into contact with each other. Of course, only a very small portion of the living beings could truly see the collision of worlds and come into contact with each other. Most of the living beings could only look in the direction where the sound came from. Vaguely, they could only be sure that some kind of shocking upheaval was taking place in that direction, but they had no idea what exactly was happening and what impact it would have on them. For the entire ice field, this change wasn't a tremor, nor was it a terrifying sound. Instead, it was just a flash of light that suddenly appeared somewhere. These flashes were as if a flash had been switched on, or as if some kind of camera was taking photos in the depths of the ice field. Faced with this situation, the entire ice field naturally didn't change because of this. It seemed that the ice field was still the same as before, maintaining the same frequency of changes as if nothing had happened. It was obvious that this situation vividly displayed the difference between the so-called worlds in the universe and the real icy planes. On the other hand, the influence of this change was not only limited to the old worlds in the ice planes. For the ice field, this change was just a flash of light, but for the interior of the ice field, for the world that was almost composed of light, this change was really earth-shattering. At this moment, hearing this sound, the living beings in the new multiverse knew that this terrifying change was not limited to the living beings in the old multiverse, but also included the living beings in the new multiverse. When the rumbling sound spread in the new multiverse, countless living beings raised their eyes from what they were doing and looked in the direction where the sound came from. Of course, compared to the old multiverse, where only 1% of the living beings in 10 who were looking in that direction could see where the change was and what exactly was happening, the number of living beings in the new multiverse who could see these changes was countless times fewer than the living beings in the old multiverse. If a ratio had to be used, perhaps only 1 in 100 million of the creatures looking in that direction would be able to clearly see what was happening in that area. The reason for this was naturally not because the living beings in the old multiverse were much more powerful than the living beings in the new multiverse. Instead, it was because the new multiverse was much further away than the place where the change was happening. Don't forget that the change and the collision happened in the old multiverse. In other words, it was equivalent to the group of worlds that those living beings lived in. Under such circumstances, if one looked at it from a macro perspective, it was as if it was happening right next to them. However, compared to the new multiverse, the place where the change happened was in another group of worlds that was extremely far away from them, and the living beings here couldn't discover it at all. Under such circumstances, it was already extremely rare for a living being to be able to see the source of the changes under the guidance of the voice. How could they ask for more? Of course, this was also because the living beings in the new multiverse had a rich cultivation path, and there were many cultivation methods that greatly improved their observational skills. If it wasn't for this advantage, and if they were like the old worlds, where almost all the cultivation methods and cultivation systems were cultivated according to the methods passed down by the wisdom ancestor, the chances of this happening would be even lower. It was even to the extent that no living being would be able to discover the source of the change, and the existence of another group of worlds. However, all these ifs and what-ifs obviously didn't happen. The current reality was that the living beings in the new multiverse had discovered the old multiverse. Damn it! The hearts of the wisdom ancestors almost skipped a few beats. All of them cursed in their hearts. The secret that they had guarded for thousands of years was actually exposed in such a ridiculous way. How could they not be angry? What do we do now? This is the most critical moment for the fusion of the multiverse. We can't spare any effort at all. Another wisdom ancestor asked the others angrily. He couldn't think of any solutions at this point. All he could hope for now was that the others could think of some good ways to deal with this situation. However, it was clear that all of the wisdom ancestors had communicated with each other for so many years, and they had already absorbed each other's strength. At this moment, all of the wisdom ancestors' wisdom was actually on the same level. Under such circumstances, if one wisdom ancestor couldn't think of something, the other wisdom ancestors naturally wouldn't be able to think of anything either. Therefore, the reply he received was silence. All of the wisdom ancestors were constantly thinking about what to do, but in the end, none of them could come up with an effective solution. If we weren't in such a hurry, perhaps we could think of a way, but now. One of the wisdom ancestors sighed. Let's not think too much for now. The most important thing now is to fuse the worlds. As long as the worlds fuse successfully, we can split our attention to do other things. If the worlds don't fuse successfully, the multiverse will be finished, and there's even less of a need to think about other things, one of the wisdom ancestors said. Hearing this, another wisdom ancestor said, "That's right, if we can't split our attention, even if we think of a perfect solution, we can't execute it." Hearing these words, the wisdom ancestors unified their thoughts and began to put the matter of the multiverse being discovered to the back of their mind. They continued to work hard to push for the continuous fusion of the multiverse. Just as they had said, this was an extremely crucial moment. This was because the multiverse had truly begun to fuse. What would the multiverse look like after the fusion? How many worlds would be destroyed in the process? How great the losses would be, and how many living beings would die in the process? All of this depended on how they handled it over the next period of time. If they handled it well, then the damage to the multiverse would be minimal. At that time, after the multiverse was fused, there would be even more powerful forces left behind. In the end, the fused world would be even larger, and there would be even more resources inside. In that case, they would have a greater chance of victory against the new myriad heavens realms. However, if they didn't handle it well, then perhaps just this fusion alone would be enough to almost completely destroy the multiverse. Perhaps at that time, the fused world might only be a few times stronger than any other world. It might even cause nearly 99% of the living beings in the multiverse to die. These two outcomes were now placed in front of them, waiting for them to choose. Under such circumstances, they really didn't have the mind to pay attention to anything else. In fact, just the changes from before had already caused this fusion to slide towards the second outcome. The number of living beings that died because of their divine clone was probably enough to fill up an extremely unbelievable world. However, the wisdom ancestors didn't feel too guilty about this, nor did they lament about their mistakes. Instead, he focused all of his attention and energy on the fusion that was about to take place. After all, if they worked hard now, then the losses would only stop at this step. However, if they didn't work hard and continued to regret and feel guilty about their mistakes, then what awaited them would be even greater losses. The number of living beings that would die would also increase by countless times. There's a new world. At this moment, in the new multiverse, the consciousnesses of the powerhouses were communicating with the multiverse. Since it was a war, there would naturally be powerhouses that stood out and allowed their positions to stand above all living beings. In fact, the most fundamental purpose of this war was to reduce the current large number of powerhouses to one. At the very least, they had to reduce it to an organization. At this moment, the new multiverse clearly hadn't reached the final stage yet. Therefore, there were currently quite a number of powerhouses that stood above all living beings and could use their consciousnesses to penetrate the multiverse and communicate with each other. Chapter 2596. Kill. The roars of those pinnacle powerhouses entered the ears of their subordinates, directly shaking their bodies and minds. The many living beings who were shocked by such a vast and boundless world instantly snapped back to their senses. They only felt that their vision had turned blood-red. The originally incomparably beautiful and vast world no longer shocked them. Instead, there was only a kind of rejection and disgust. Under the urging of this rejection and disgust, as they roared, they pounced towards the place in this vast world that was clearly where living beings gathered. In the blink of an eye, they had already rushed into that world. As they rushed into this world, the wind and clouds began to surge. It was unknown how many thunders and tremors appeared in this world. The entire world seemed to have suddenly come to life and began to madly reject the new living beings that had rushed in from the various worlds. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. At this moment, in the depths of that world, the wisdom ancestors were filled with surprise. "The world is mending," one of the wisdom ancestors cried out in surprise. At this moment, the other wisdom ancestors were also indescribably happy. The reason was very simple. At this moment, in the depths of that world, in the many areas where cracks could originally be seen, under the effect of some external force, those cracks were rapidly mending. Originally, they had spent a great deal of effort and energy but were still unable to truly close the crack. However, in the blink of an eye, 1/1000th of the crack had already disappeared. Although this speed wasn't too fast, one mustn't forget that this was based on the entire world as a base. And this world was formed by who knew how many tens of thousands of worlds, or even hundreds of millions of worlds, were gathered together. With such a huge base, even if 100 millionth of the cracks disappeared, the absolute number was already extremely considerable. How could this not make the wisdom ancestors feel indescribably happy? As the wisdom ancestors, these living beings' innate intelligence was naturally quite powerful. At this moment, they only needed a little thought to understand the source of all this. They even understood how to speed up the speed of this mending. So, as long as there is an external enemy, this world can be stimulated. "Looks like this war can't end too early," one of the wisdom ancestors lamented. Hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors nodded indifferently. That was how it was. Although this world was filled with countless cracks, it was still a world and could be considered complete. Under such circumstances, the world's various instincts and even the world's will had already taken shape. If this kind of embryonic form continued to develop normally, perhaps it would take an incomparably long period of time before it could truly grow and truly become the instinct and will of the world that was the complete world. However, if there was a change in the situation and an external enemy joined the fray, then this growth process that originally required a long period of time would obviously be shortened, just like how a person would become more powerful in the face of a life and death crisis. It would stimulate a stronger potential. When the world encountered a life and death crisis, their potential would also erupt. Growth that originally required a long time to accumulate could also be obtained in an instant. The reason why the crack in the depths of this world had healed was because the invading power of the old world had become so powerful that it could threaten the life and death of this world. It should be noted that this new universe was a chaotic cluster of worlds. Within it, wars between worlds were breaking out at almost every moment. It was easy to imagine how good the cultivation civilization, which had developed under such a background, was at invading other worlds. And now, the top powerhouses of the old universes were using the technology they had used to invade other universes to invade the old universes. In this way, when they entered this world, they had already used all kinds of technology and all kinds of preparations they had made before to separate themselves from the world, avoiding direct attacks from this world. Then, with the help of all kinds of conversion methods, they transformed the powerful destructive power into destructive power that the laws of this world could accept. After that, under the guidance of various techniques, they automatically understood the distribution of power in this world. Therefore, when they pounced towards the places where the living beings gathered, these peak powerhouses also divided themselves into different groups. The proportion of people who headed towards different places was completely different. The power was the strongest in the key places, while the power was slightly weaker in the secondary places. It could be said that in an extremely short period of time, they had already grasped the crux of this world. In the face of such an invasion, the living beings in this vast world reacted one by one and understood that this disaster wasn't the natural disaster that had caused the drastic changes in the world before. Therefore, they quickly gathered their strength and began to brazenly face the invaders. Although they didn't have the wisdom ancestor to guide them, the living beings in the old universe were actually not weak. Especially during the disaster of the fusion of the universe this time, they had gained a lot of enlightenment, and in the end, their strength had unknowingly increased by a few times or even several times. Under such circumstances, although the fighting power they erupted with when facing the invaders was weaker than that of the invaders, it wasn't that much weaker. At the very least, they could still fight back and forth with the invaders, and they could also cause considerable losses to the invaders. Of course, this was under the circumstances that the peak experts hadn't joined in. The peak experts were much stronger than the invaders, and they could even control their emotions with a single sentence. Compared to the living beings in this world, their minds were much stronger. Under such circumstances, if they joined such a normal invading team, the increase in the invading team's strength would definitely be earth-shattering. However, it was obvious that the peak experts had their own mission at that time. Their mission was to find the peak experts of this world. As long as there were cultivators in a world, as long as there were extraordinary living beings, then there would definitely be peak experts who far surpassed all other living beings. The only difference was how powerful the pinnacle experts were. It was the pinnacle of the world, or the pinnacle of the myriad of worlds, or perhaps it was the true, supreme pinnacle. No matter what kind of peak it was, as long as they were peak experts, they were obviously not simple people. In their own world, the strength they could display would be far stronger than their normal strength. In addition to this unimaginably vast world that even these peak experts were extremely shocked, it was hard to say how powerful the peak experts of this world were. In that case, how could these pinnacle powerhouses not set their sights on the pinnacle powerhouses of this world? If they ignored them and waited for them to make their move, the entire world might be overturned, and all the invaders might be wiped out in an instant. It wasn't like this hadn't happened in the past. Therefore, at this time, these peak experts were exploring this world on their own, searching for the peak experts of this world. However, no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find the existence of such peak experts. In the entire world, it seemed like only the living beings that were resisting the invaders were left in front of them, and they only had some ability to resist. This situation made those peak powerhouses feel apprehensive. There were a few reasons why they couldn't find the peak experts. Firstly, there were no peak experts in this world that were worthy of their attention. Secondly, the peak experts were hiding in a place that they hadn't discovered. Thirdly, which was also what they were most worried about, was that the peak experts were far stronger than them. It was precisely because they were so powerful that they couldn't find their existences no matter how hard they searched. This made them certain that there were no peak experts in this world. Obviously, no matter how they thought about it, the first possibility was impossible. In that case, there were obviously only the second and third possibilities. Regardless of the second or third possibility, it was obviously not a good thing for them. Needless to say, the third possibility was far stronger than them, so much so that they couldn't even sense it. They might be wiped out by a finger at any time. The second possibility seemed to be better than the third, but in fact, there was a limit to how good it was. After all, if they were hiding in a place that they couldn't find at all, wouldn't it be like they were hiding in the dark while they were in the light? In that case, the enemy didn't need to be too strong. As long as their strength was acceptable, they could get rid of them one by one through sneak attacks. Because of this, the more these peak experts couldn't find the peak experts, the more vigilant they were. For a time, they naturally didn't have the time to participate in the real invasion. In this way, the invading subordinates and the living beings in the old heavens and realms that originally existed in this world fell into a state of protracted war. They fought back and forth, and the losses they suffered at every moment were enough to make both sides feel heartache. In such a battle, Both sides' advantages and disadvantages were equally obvious. For the invaders, they had crossed through space and could be said to be a lone army deep in the enemy's territory. Not only were their logistics limited, but there were also fewer combatants if they died. Their ability to continue fighting was far worse than that of the Guardians. Compared to their disadvantages, their advantage was that they were stronger and more experienced when it came to invading. This kind of valiant strength and rich experience was enough for them to use the fastest speed to extract the resources from the territories they occupied in this world and turn them into potential for war. For the Guardian living beings, their disadvantage was very obvious. Compared to the invaders, they were weaker. This weak strength caused them to retreat step by step in the battle, constantly giving up the resources of this world and allowing their opponents to seize them. Compared to this disadvantage, their advantage was also quite obvious. This advantage was none other than the fact that this was their world. This was because this was their world, and they were fighting on their home ground. Even if they lost a living being, they could be replenished at the same time. Moreover, the various geographical advantages of this world were also quite advantageous to them. The speed at which the resources were converted into power was also quite fast. In this way, as long as they could drag things out long enough, they would eventually be able to reverse the situation step by step and finally obtain victory. As long as their opponents didn't come to replenish their forces, they wouldn't be destroyed before that happened. This kind of battle was constantly going on. For this world, it was equivalent to constantly increasing the pressure. Under such circumstances, in the depths of this world, the cracks at the border of the various worlds were also constantly mending. As this happened, the wisdom ancestor, who was guarding and pushing everything forward, was both worried and delighted. Needless to say, they were happy to see the world quickly becoming complete and their initial plan being completed step by step. How could they not be happy? However, they were worried because they had already understood the nature of the cracks mending. The more cracks mended and the faster they mended, it meant that the situation outside was getting more and more dangerous. It was even to the point where the world was destroyed and civilization was on the verge of extinction. How could they not be worried? In the face of such a situation, the wisdom ancestor could only do their best to help this world mend the cracks and make it complete so that they could be free to deal with the invaders as soon as possible. Suddenly, one of the wisdom ancestor lamented, "The laws brought by that sky alternate being are simply too powerful." "What? You've analyzed it?" Another wisdom ancestor was taken aback and asked in surprise. One must know that if one didn't analyze the laws, it wouldn't be appropriate to praise the power of those laws. However, the wisdom ancestor was actually praising it at this moment and was even acting so resolutely. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed like they had gained something. "That's right, I've already analyzed it." At this moment, the wisdom ancestor sighed. As he spoke, a ball of laws appeared out of thin air in the senses of many wisdom ancestors. Chapter 2597. "But, how is this possible?" one of the wisdom ancestors said in disbelief. Upon hearing this, the wisdom ancestor who had spoken first said, "What's impossible about it? You have to know that this is our world." He accentuated the words, "we." These words clearly expressed the meaning that he wanted to express vividly. The other wisdom ancestors also came to a sudden realization. Indeed, if these laws had appeared in a world where any of them had perfect control, it wouldn't have taken much effort for them to extract them. In fact, their instincts alone would have allowed them to do it. From this perspective, it wasn't surprising that the wisdom ancestor was able to do this. What's special about these laws? One of the wisdom ancestors grasped the key point and asked directly. It stands above the myriad of worlds in the heavens. I can feel a kind of transcendence from them. The wisdom ancestor seemed to be in an indescribable shock as his voice trembled slightly. Above? Transcendence? The other wisdom ancestors were dumbfounded. It was just a type of law, yet it was able to stand above the universe and possess the kind of transcendence that they dreamed of. How could they not be shocked? How could they not be shocked? At this moment, the wisdom ancestor didn't continue speaking. Instead, he sent the clump of laws that he had analyzed and extracted into the communication space of the other wisdom ancestors. Although the many wisdom ancestors seemed to be facing each other, they were actually quite far away from each other. The reason why they could appear as if they were facing each other was because they used their senses to forcefully construct a communication space that resembled real space-time. The essence of this communication space was naturally illusory. It only existed because these wisdom ancestors believed that it existed. However, even in such a space of communication, due to the extremely high essence of the wisdom ancestors, it possessed some characteristics of real space-time. For example, sending the laws of the present into the communication space allowed the wisdom ancestors to inspect, analyze, and research them at will. This was one of the characteristics. At this moment, this clump of laws appeared in the communication space and was instantly imprinted in the senses of the wisdom ancestors. Just now, when the wisdom ancestor took out the law that had been analyzed and refined, although they could sense it from afar, it was only a tiny bit from afar. It couldn't even be considered a blur, so how could they truly come to a complete conclusion? But now, when the wisdom ancestor placed the clump of laws in the communication space, they could clearly feel the clump of laws and understand the indescribable characteristics contained within the clump of laws. This is the laws of beyond the heavens? The wisdom ancestors were all shocked. If it were not for the fact that they had already experienced a few times, they would have been able to maintain the stability of their current mission no matter what happened. Otherwise, just the shock alone would have been enough to bring a shocking amount of damage to this world, causing a large portion of the living beings that had survived the various dangers to die at this moment. In the clump of laws, they didn't know if they felt a sense of superiority or detachment, but they also felt an indescribable sense of perfection. This kind of perfection was so obvious and intense that they suddenly felt that all the power, laws, and realms that they had grasped were riddled with holes and had no redeeming qualities at all. More importantly, even though they felt this kind of perfection and such a great disparity, they couldn't find a way to perfect themselves. This feeling was the most despairing. At this moment, they understood why this kind of perfection was so much more intense than the feeling of superiority and detachment. Why the wisdom ancestor, who was the first to obtain this clump of laws, didn't mention this kind of perfection at all and treated it as if it didn't exist. This was clearly because of the incomparably intense sense of defeat and despair that welled up in their hearts. It was precisely because of this sense of defeat and despair that the wisdom ancestor wasn't willing to mention this matter at all. In fact, he would rather use this kind of self-deceiving method to ignore it. At this moment, the other wisdom ancestors also had the same impulse. He wanted to ignore this matter. He wanted to ignore this kind of perfection. Is this our limit? At that moment, one of the wisdom progenitors suddenly spoke. His voice was filled with defeat, despair, and an indescribable unwillingness. Perhaps we have misunderstood that foreign mutant. At this moment, another wisdom ancestor suddenly spoke. Misunderstood? Another wisdom ancestor asked in confusion. Perhaps to that foreign mutant, our universe is nothing more than an illusory projection reflected in a mirror. Is it really interested in occupying such an illusory projection? Are you interested in turning the myriad heavens and myriad worlds into your own? The ancestor of wisdom spoke again. Upon hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors fell silent. They couldn't help but admit that this explanation was actually very reasonable. For example, they weren't interested in the illusions of certain living beings at all. Even if they entered the illusions to explore, they would at most investigate the principles behind the illusions. They definitely wouldn't want to take the illusions for themselves. Using this analogy, Just the laws that the foreign mutant itself controlled were already countless times more perfect than the laws of the universe. To him, what was the difference between the myriad heavens and realms and the dream world? Since there was no difference, their previous guesses that the otherworldly creature had come in with a scheme to plot against them and take over the myriad heavens and realms as its own were, of course, no longer valid. However, it was a challenge to their self-esteem to admit it. Thus, at this moment, the wisdom ancestors all continued to remain silent. Suddenly, one of the wisdom ancestors asked, "Is there really no way to break through?" Hearing this, the other progenitors of wisdom instantly turned their chaotic thoughts back from all over the place and focused on the question that was raised at this moment. Compared to challenging their pride, this question that concerned their future achievements was clearly more important. It was also more worthy of their attention. At this moment, the wisdom ancestor who had taken out the laws suddenly said, "Actually, the solution is right in front of us, isn't it?" Those words stunned all of the wisdom progenitors. They didn't understand what the wisdom ancestor meant by right in front of us. The difference in wisdom between them wasn't huge. Even if there was a small difference, it wasn't enough for one person to think of something that the others couldn't think of. Under such circumstances, they didn't think that someone could actually think of a solution for something that they couldn't figure out. In fact, the solution had already been placed in front of them. Under such circumstances, the wisdom ancestors practically racked their brains and tried their best to think of everything, searching for a possible way for them to break through as the wisdom ancestors. The wisdom ancestor who had said that there was a solution didn't say much. He just stared at the clump of laws in the communication space. When some of the wisdom ancestors occasionally glanced at him, they discovered that something was amiss and couldn't help but shift their gazes from everywhere to the clump of laws. Soon after, more and more wisdom ancestors discovered that something was amiss and couldn't help but shift their gazes to the clump of laws in the communication space. Following this, the scene fell silent again. However, compared to before, this silence was a completely different kind of silence. Previously there was confusion and oppression, but now there was hesitation, surprise, and hesitation, fusing with these laws. If that's the case, won't we also become extraterrestrial oddities? If that's the case, won't we be rejected by the universe? One of the wisdom ancestors said. Hearing this, the other wisdom ancestors didn't answer. However, from the changes in their expressions, it was clear that they were also hesitant about this. They had already found what they lacked, what they were fundamentally lacking. Although they couldn't figure out how to perfect themselves, wasn't that perfect standard right in front of them? As long as they could integrate that perfect standard into their own bodies, from the inside to the outside, they could completely transform into that perfect standard state. Then, wouldn't they be able to make up for their own shortcomings and flaws? However, if that was the case, their essence would also change. From the wisdom ancestors that were originally favored by the universe, they would become extraterrestrial oddities that were rejected by the universe. If that was the case, the old universe, which was originally their home field, might immediately turn around and treat them as mortal enemies. Endless attacks and endless tribulations would instantly pour down on them. In that case, whether or not they could still live was a problem, let alone become perfect and take a step further to transcend. Suddenly, one of the wisdom ancestors said, "Let's wait until the world's transformation is complete." These words caused the other wisdom ancestors to heave a sigh of relief. Although they had only pushed the issue back, they were still able to relax at this time. They finally had the time and opportunity to breathe a sigh of relief. They didn't have to make a decision right now. As such, to them, this was, of course, a good thing that was hard to come by. Then, what should we do with this clump of laws? One of the wisdom ancestors asked. Put it away, another wisdom ancestor said. The wisdom ancestor who took out the clump of laws first nodded. With a wave of his hand, the clump of laws left the communication space and returned to his hand. He put it away. During this process, the senses of the other wisdom ancestors were all focused on this mass of laws, and they seemed to be in a rather impatient state. The wisdom ancestor, who had put away the laws, was well aware of this, but he had no intention of paying attention to it. He believed that everyone's final decision would be the same as his own, and they would fuse the laws into themselves. After the clump of laws was put away, the communication space fell into complete silence. In the following days, the many wisdom ancestors seemed to be quite busy. They only maintained the world so that it wouldn't collapse. As for what they were originally doing, which was trying their best to speed up the closing of the cracks in the world, they no longer had the mood to care about it. In contrast, in that world, in the battlefield between the invaders from other worlds and the native anti-invasion forces of this world, there were more forces. These forces existed in these battlefields, as if they were coveting and gathering something. Faintly discernible from time to time, an invisible existence would be snatched away from the battlefield and disappear into the void, as if it had never appeared. Apart from the wisdom ancestors, no one else knew about this situation. It was the same for the new pinnacle powerhouses of the various worlds. In this battle, they still withdrew themselves from the outside and worked hard to search for pinnacle powerhouses that existed in the old worlds that were at least on par with them. These pinnacle powerhouses were only focused on searching for hidden places in this world, searching for the hidden space-time that existed in the depths of the void, trying to find hidden existences that could threaten them. Although they paid some attention to the battlefield, they only paid attention to the general situation and the situation of the invaders' victory. Because of the inaction of the wisdom ancestors, the invaders were winning again and again. Although they hadn't completely defeated the resistance in this world, they had already unknowingly built a considerable number of strongholds in this world. They even started to use this world's resources to support the upcoming battles and replenish their various consumption during the battles. This situation clearly made up for the invaders' weakness of not being able to fight a prolonged battle. For the invaders, the advantage they had was self-evident. Chapter 2598. The invasion and anti-invasion war lasted for an unimaginably long time. It was so much so that the reinforcements from the other worlds were already prepared, and the war was still going on. Apart from the fact that the vast and boundless world had become even bloodier and filled with a baleful aura, it didn't seem much different from the beginning. The wisdom ancestor was still hidden in the depths of the world, while the new pinnacle powerhouses of the various worlds were still carefully searching the world. At this moment, several hundred years had passed for both of them. It's about time. On this day, in the depths of the world, a wisdom ancestor said. For several hundred years, due to the pressure from the invaders, the healing of the world had continued. Now, hundreds of years later, this kind of healing was already close to a limit. This boundary was, of course, not the boundary that all the cracks in the depths of the world could completely heal. Even if there was external pressure, with the number of cracks in the depths of the world and the speed at which they were healing, several hundred years wouldn't be enough for them to completely heal. In fact, this boundary was the boundary of this world's stability. When the number and width of the cracks exceeded this limit, if there was no external force to maintain it, the world would collapse and scatter due to the rejection of the many parts. In the end, it would turn back into countless fragments, and the world would turn back into the heavens and realms. When the number and width of the cracks decreased or shrunk to below the boundary, then the world would truly become a world, and the structure of this single world would truly stabilize. In other words, as long as this boundary was broken, from now on, the world would no longer need the power of the wisdom ancestor. Just by relying on the power of the world itself, it would be able to maintain its integrity and continue to automatically heal the cracks in the depths of the world. In the end, after a long time, the entire world would truly be completely healed and truly complete. It could be said that this boundary was a crucial boundary for both the world and the wisdom ancestor. As long as this boundary was broken, then the wisdom ancestor would truly be able to extricate themselves and start doing whatever they originally wanted to do. For this world, crossing this boundary also meant that it had truly taken shape. It meant that it had truly been born. It no longer needed to look at the faces of other living beings or struggle at death's door. Indeed, it's about time. Next, I plan to drive out that invader first. What do you all think? Another ancestor of wisdom said. I feel that there's no need to expel them anymore. At that moment, a wisdom ancestor suddenly spoke up. These words caused the expressions of the other wisdom ancestors to change slightly. One of them asked, "Why do you say that? Haven't you noticed? Their rules have unknowingly integrated into this world. Even though we've been collecting the rules on them, we've only been able to collect a small portion of them. The majority of the laws have scattered into the world. After such a long time, they have already become a part of the world." The wisdom ancestor, who had said that there was no need to expel them, sighed as he explained. Hearing this, the expressions of the other wisdom ancestors changed slightly. Their intelligence was similarly brilliant, so how could they possibly be unable to discern exactly what the wisdom ancestor was trying to express? He was clearly saying that the invaders had already been acknowledged by the world. Currently, the battle between the invaders and the living beings of the world had unknowingly become an internal conflict of the world, an internal struggle. Under such circumstances, even if the living beings of the world won, the wisdom ancestor wouldn't be happy. Even if the invaders won, the wisdom ancestor would only be happy to see it happen. No matter what, I'm not willing to sit by and watch as my civilization falls, another wisdom ancestor said indifferently. His words were filled with determination. The expressions of the other wisdom ancestors changed slightly. Some were praising, some agreed, some were disdainful, some were indifferent, and some were even disgusted. All of these attitudes had clearly displayed the thoughts of the wisdom ancestors in full display. Sensing everyone's attitudes, the wisdom ancestors understood that the days of mutual trust between them were about to pass. Next, when the world crossed that boundary, it would be time for them to go their separate ways. What's going on with this world? In that world, a peak powerhouse had a somewhat indescribable expression on his face. Ever since the beginning, the feeling this world gave him had started to change bit by bit. It was just that the change was extremely slow and subtle, so it didn't attract their attention. But after the accumulation of hundreds of years, this change had unknowingly strengthened to the extent that they couldn't help but pay attention to it. Compared to before, the rejection from this world had actually weakened to the point that it was almost non-existent. Originally, when they were near this world, they felt as if they were beside a colossal beast that could turn over and completely crush them into powder at any time. Even if they were just here, they couldn't help but tremble and want to escape. But now, although they could still feel that this world was rejecting them, this rejection seemed to be of a completely different nature. Instead, it seemed to be a rejection that came from their own rejection of the world, and not the world truly rejecting them. What the hell? Why do I have this feeling? We're clearly invaders. How can there be a world that welcomes invaders? Thinking about it, the peak powerhouse shook his head and wanted to get rid of his misconception. But as time passed, this feeling became more and more obvious. In the end, it reached a point that even if he tried to get rid of it time and time again, he still couldn't get rid of it completely. Perhaps I should give it a try. This thought appeared in his mind. Just as he was thinking about this, one of the pinnacle experts had already released his means of isolation from the world and was directly exposed in that world. At this moment, a terrifying suction force suddenly came from that peak powerhouse and started to frantically engulf the mysterious aura that belonged to that world. That aura frantically surged into the body of the pinnacle expert, pushing him towards a higher level. In just a few breaths of time, the pinnacle expert had taken another small step towards the pinnacle. He's a step ahead of me? At this moment, That peak powerhouse furrowed his brows, and this thought flashed in his mind. However, he didn't immediately release his defensive method along with that peak powerhouse. Instead, he started to carefully observe that peak powerhouse to see if there were any changes to his body. Before this, he was anxious to test what would happen if he was completely exposed to that world. But now that someone had gotten ahead of him, he wasn't anxious anymore. After all, what he wanted to know could be obtained from someone else. Furthermore, he didn't have to take the risk himself, so it was naturally for the best. If the other party had obtained some benefits, then even though it would be a little slower for him to come back, it wouldn't be a big deal at all. However, if the other party suffered a loss, it would be equivalent to him denying the option of directly exposing himself to the world. All these thoughts flashed through his mind at this moment, causing him to pay even more attention to that peak powerhouse who had been exposed to the world. With his perceptive ability, he could clearly sense that apart from himself, the other peak powerhouses were also paying attention to that peak powerhouse who had been exposed. Clearly, they had also thought of the same thing as the other two and were also treating that peak powerhouse who had been exposed to the world as a test subject. So that's how it is. At this moment, that peak powerhouse who had been exposed suddenly burst into laughter. As he laughed, a strong aura suddenly seeped out of his body, and his entire temperament began to rise rapidly. In the blink of an eye, the power fluctuations that emanated from his body broke through to another realm. As his power fluctuations broke through to another realm, he seemed to completely not exist in the eyes of the many peak powerhouses. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared without a trace. What's going on? The other peak powerhouses were all dumbfounded. At this moment, their attitudes had all changed. Some were extremely surprised and wanted to expose themselves to that world as well. However, some were inexplicably panicked and tried their best to strengthen their own defenses, trying their best to isolate themselves from the outside world. The reason for this was obviously that they now had a different view of that peak powerhouse who had been exposed. Those peak powerhouses who wanted to lift their defenses and expose themselves clearly thought that the test subject had already obtained great benefits, and his strength had increased to an unimaginable, undetectable level. As for the remaining peak powerhouses, they thought that the test subject had already been integrated or eliminated by the world. This was the only way that they could completely not sense the existence of that peak powerhouse. As they split up, the peak powerhouses lifted their defenses one by one and directly exposed themselves. Then, endless power, endless information, and endless mysterious aura continuously surged into the bodies of those peak powerhouses, pushing their realms forward continuously. In just a short period of time, they had completed a breakthrough that would have originally taken who knew how many tens of thousands of years to complete. Then, one after another, they stepped into a realm that other peak experts couldn't detect, disappearing from the senses of those peak experts. The speed at which they changed varied, but the speed was not completely related to their strength, comprehension, and accumulation. Instead, it was related to the speed at which they lifted their defenses. The faster they lifted their defenses, the faster they would transform. This was the case even if they had very little accumulation, and the slower they lifted their defenses, the slower they would transform, even if they had accumulated a lot of accumulation. If I die, then so be it. At this moment, the peak powerhouse who had wanted to be the first to lift his defenses but had been beaten to it by someone else thought to himself. He immediately dispersed the barrier that he had set up to isolate himself from the outside world. As he dispersed the barrier, his body seemed to have instantly turned into a black hole and began to frantically absorb everything in the outside world. It was not just power, aura, or even just aura. It was an existence that was even more fundamental and more fundamental. It was an existence that filled the entire world and made people feel as if it was the origin of the world. It was a kind of chill. As this chill surged into him, he felt that everything about him was being sublimated. The mysterious feeling that originally existed in the depths of his body that he could not fathom at all and only felt like it was an instinct started to rapidly expand at this moment. In the end, it replaced his body, replaced all the power in his body, all the laws, all the space-time, and completely filled his body. As this change occurred, the peak powerhouse felt his body and mind start to frantically improve. In a daze, he saw an incomparably majestic figure. It was a figure that he felt extremely close to, as if it was everything in the universe. The figure only glanced at him indifferently before disappearing. However, just this glance was enough to make the peak powerhouse feel an indescribable joy and an unimaginable sense of fulfillment. It was as if just this glance had already made him experience an indescribable sublimation. At this moment, he felt that he had already reached perfection. Everything that he had been paying attention to seemed to have become insignificant in the face of this perfection, and there was no longer any meaning to it. So that's how it is. An indescribable emotion appeared in his heart, causing him to involuntarily let out a sigh like the other peak powerhouses from before. As he sighed, he felt that he had broken into a realm that he had always dreamed of. A realm where he could control everything, experience everything, and observe everything. A realm where he could see with a single glance exactly where the peak powerhouses in this world were. Could it be that this is your mentality? Did you think that we were merely ants in the past, and that as long as you cared about us, you could completely erase us in an instant? He said as he looked at the wisdom ancestors that existed in the depths of the world. At this moment, he only had eyes for the wisdom ancestors. This was because they felt that the wisdom ancestors had an existence that was of the same origin as them, but it was faintly purer. Chapter 2599. In comparison, the current wisdom ancestor and the peak powerhouses were like salt, while the world was a living being that needed salt. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors were like extremely pure salt. As for the peak powerhouses, they were like salt that had been added to various ingredients and mixed with other flavors. Any living being that had a normal sense of taste would find it difficult to consume pure salt. However, if salt was added to ingredients, even if there was a little more salt, it would still be acceptable to living beings that had a normal sense of taste. That was why the world's attitude towards the peak powerhouses and the wisdom ancestors was so different at this moment. The wisdom ancestor could clearly see this difference at this moment. At this moment, an indescribable joy surged in his heart. The conflict, shame, and guilt he felt before he fused with the laws from the otherworldly mutants had already disappeared without a trace. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already broken through this world and stepped out of it. After arriving outside the world, he felt relaxed. The origin energy that existed outside the world that gave birth to the world, in other words, the chill, was a lot thinner than in the world. If this thinness was in the past, it would have made him feel uncomfortable. However, at this moment, it meant that the suppression had been reduced. However, no matter how small it was, the suppression still existed. Thus, at this moment, he turned his gaze in a certain direction. In that direction was everything that he was looking forward to. This was the feeling that appeared in his heart. This feeling was similar to intuition, or even a premonition. At this time, one wisdom ancestor after another stepped out from that world and appeared beside him. At the same time, the figures of the wisdom ancestors also changed. From their original strange forms, they turned into humanoid figures. It was just that some of the wisdom ancestors' human forms were more perfect, while others were missing something. However, even if they were missing something, they were only missing a few small details. As time passed, they were still undergoing subtle adjustments. Their bodies were becoming more and more perfect, more and more similar to human forms. Evidently, the wisdom ancestors had already fused with the laws from the otherworldly mutants that they had gathered over the years. When they said those words, the expressions of the wisdom ancestors all changed. Compared to before, they seemed to be extremely carefree now. They seemed to have broken free from all shackles, and they even faintly emitted a feeling of perfection. What should we do with them? One of the ancestor of wisdom asked. He was naturally referring to the people of their race that existed in that world. Hearing that, the wisdom ancestors smiled, but none of them answered the question. To these wisdom ancestors, everything in that world, including their own kind and the creatures that called them ancestors, was meaningless. When the wisdom ancestor heard the silence, he naturally understood what the other wisdom ancestors were thinking and could not help but sigh. Then, he didn't continue to dwell on that question. Instead, he seemed to change the topic and asked, "So, shall we set off now? Let's go. There's no longer anything worth staying here." Another ancestor of wisdom said calmly. As he said that, the other wisdom ancestors nodded. Immediately, everyone turned into rays of light that emitted faint heat and headed in the direction that they sensed. To them, that direction was no different from any other direction. It was only because they had sensed it that they chose that direction. However, if one were to look at it from outside the ice field, the direction they had chosen right now was actually upwards. They were heading towards the ice field. The ice field was extremely vast in Luofan's eyes. To the wisdom ancestors that were born in the world of the ice field, it was almost boundless. Even though they were guided by the senses in their hearts, and even though they had fused with the laws of the otherworldly beings, causing their power to skyrocket by tens of thousands of times, it still took them over 1,000 years to barely approach the surface of the ice field. At this moment, the surface of the ice field was still constantly cracking and mending. When they arrived at this place, the wisdom ancestors all stopped at the same time. To the living beings outside, what was before them was just a very ordinary surface of ice. However, to them, what was before them was the barrier between the outer sky and the inner sky. Once they crossed this barrier, they would be in the outer sky. If they didn't cross this barrier, they would be in the inner sky. Outside the barrier, they could clearly sense the endless mysterious power that they yearned for. Even through the barrier, they could clearly sense this power. In fact, they could even vaguely absorb a little of it. At this moment, to the living beings outside, it seemed like there were small spots of light flickering under the surface of the ice as if they were breathing. What they were absorbing was none other than heat. At this moment, this place was naturally not a place with a lot of heat. In fact, compared to the normal regions of this world, the temperature here was much lower. Even living beings that liked low temperatures would feel that this place was rather cold. However, this was only to the living beings outside. To the living beings that were born in the world inside the ice, the temperature they had always been exposed to was the temperature inside the ice. It was the terrifying low temperature that was derived from the source of the cold law. Compared to the terrifying low temperature, the temperature above the ice that was extremely low to ordinary living beings was already an extremely high temperature to them. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors even felt an indescribable sense of panic amidst their extreme desire. It was a kind of panic caused by the fear of the boundless heat behind the barrier. While the wisdom ancestors had been traveling for thousands of years, in the world formed by the fusion of the old heavens and realms, the war of invasion and anti-invasion was still ongoing. However, compared to the beginning, this war was many times more relaxed. At the very beginning, the kind of fighting to the death had completely disappeared. Instead, it was more like a battle between two different races in this world. As for the peak powerhouses, they had already started to settle down in this world and become the peak powerhouses of this world. Their degree of integration with this world had unknowingly surpassed that of the wisdom ancestors back then. At this moment, no one would feel that it was wrong to say that they were experts that were born and raised in this world. At this stage, these peak powerhouses felt that this world was too wonderful and too comfortable. They even felt that as long as they were in this world, they would be able to improve endlessly and make endless progress, It was such a wonderful feeling that they didn't even want to leave this world. One by one, they moved their bases from the new worlds to this world. As for the territories in the new heavens and realms that they had in mind, they even felt that they were of little value and even had thoughts of giving them up. It must be known that they had spent a lot of effort and sacrificed a lot in order to seize those territories. None of these peak powerhouses felt that there was anything unusual about these strange changes. They only felt that they could only be considered to be truly complete in this world. They felt that as long as they could raise this world to a higher level, they would also be able to rise to a higher level. Apart from that, there was actually no need for the various heavens and realms or resources. In fact, it was this change in attitude that caused the invasion and anti-invasion war in this world to gradually ease up. After all, the living beings in this world had received the grace of these peak powerhouses time and time again. They had received their care time and time again. Moreover, the invaders had also become more and more amiable towards them. They had repeatedly expressed that they wanted to live in peace with them and only wanted to find a foothold in this world. Under such circumstances, without the wisdom ancestor controlling everything from behind the scenes, it was only natural that their attitudes would ease up a little. On a certain day, a peak powerhouse sighed and said to another peak powerhouse, "It's a pity that the wisdom ancestor escaped back then. Otherwise, we would have achieved perfection a long time ago." Because they had settled in this world together, and because they no longer had an urgent need for resources, the conflict between these peak powerhouses was naturally no longer so irreconcilable. Just like that, their relationship naturally became much closer after 1,000 years. At the very least, they were now more like friends, or rather, fellow cultivators. Another peak powerhouse smiled and said, "Why should we not be content? We only need to continue staying in this world, and after a certain period of time, we will naturally be able to achieve perfection. In comparison, it's not much different from directly devouring them. It's also safer, so what's there to be dissatisfied about? Even so, why do I feel that there's something wrong with their departure?" The peak powerhouse who spoke earlier sighed. "What's wrong? They know that they can't beat us, so they fled together. Isn't that normal?" The peak powerhouse who spoke later laughed. "Although they can't beat us, the gap shouldn't be so big that they have no choice but to flee. If it were me, I wouldn't give up this world no matter what. Even if I have to fight to the death, I will die in this world," the peak powerhouse said with an extremely firm attitude. This kind of attitude would never appear on him in the past. As a peak powerhouse, he had experienced countless battles, choices, and moments of life and death. How could he be the kind of person who would rather die than submit? How could he easily give up his life for something? Normally, when faced with an unstoppable force, he would probably abandon even his own son. How could he give up his life for a world? However, at this moment, such words came out of his mouth without any contradiction. During this process, whether it was him or the peak powerhouse who heard these words, they didn't feel anything unusual. It was as if it was only natural. Now that you put it this way, it's indeed a little strange. However, no matter what they think, even if they want to come back now, there's no other way. We don't need to care about them at all." The peak powerhouse thought for a while and shook his head. "Indeed. Now that our foundation in this world has been stabilized, even if they come back, they will become outsiders. We don't need to fear them anymore." The peak powerhouse who spoke first laughed. His expression was full of satisfaction. It wasn't just these two peak powerhouses who felt satisfied at this moment. The other peak powerhouses were also very satisfied and felt extremely satisfied. This incomparably vast world had become their own world, and they had become the rulers of this world. This result was even more wonderful and satisfying than the feeling of conquering countless worlds in the past. Under such circumstances, how could they not feel satisfied? In a place that they couldn't see, in the depths of the world, the crack in the world had unknowingly closed by 90%. This closing speed was tens of thousands of times faster than the original estimation of the wisdom ancestor. Normally, it would probably take millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of years to close to this extent. Apart from this closing, there seemed to be something mysterious on the origin of this world. It seemed to be an existence that was completely opposite to the nature of the origin. This existence was entangled with the origin, maintaining an indescribable balance in an extremely mysterious way. Through this balance, the entire world was evolving and sublimating bit by bit from a macro perspective. This world that was originally completely integrated with the ice field had unknowingly gained a sense of existence. Chapter 2600. At this moment, the wisdom ancestors all felt their hairs stand on end. It was as if they had become weak ants that were being eyed by a ferocious beast. This feeling made the wisdom ancestors' hearts clench. Who's targeting us? The same thought appeared in their minds at the same time. Just as this thought appeared in their minds, the healing of the world just happened to cross the boundary. It finally became a world that could repair itself and no longer needed external assistance to heal itself. Faced with this situation, the wisdom ancestors suddenly felt an indescribable sense of emptiness. It was as if some mysterious protection that had been placed on them had loosened up at that moment. Along with this feeling, the hair-raising feeling from before became even more intense at this moment. If they had felt like ants being eyed by a ferocious beast before, then now, they felt like ants being eyed by a divine dragon. This world has abandoned us. One of the wisdom ancestors roared in shock and anger. At this moment, an invading pinnacle powerhouse who had already undergone a transformation flashed and appeared beside one of the wisdom ancestors. He raised his hand and grabbed at the wisdom ancestor. The wisdom ancestor's form was extremely strange. It wasn't a human form, nor was it the form of a living being with flesh and blood that existed in the outside world. Instead, it was like a ball of ever-changing brilliance. At that moment, the living being's body shuddered when it was grabbed, and waves of mysterious power naturally emerged to block the peak powerhouse. The peak powerhouse came from a new universe. In this new universe, due to the influence of the rules of the otherworldly alternate entity, although its essence was similar to a light living being, its form was similar to that of a human. At the very least, the brilliant ones, such as the pinnacle powerhouses, had a form that was almost indistinguishable from a human form. Under such circumstances, the peak powerhouse's attack on the wisdom ancestor was like a humanoid living being attacking some kind of ever-changing monster. "How dare you!" another wisdom ancestor roared furiously. Then, with a flash of his body, he traversed through the void from where he was and arrived at the place where the wisdom ancestor was being attacked. Then, he launched an attack at the peak powerhouse. Facing such an attack, the pinnacle expert only sneered. His body moved, and as he circulated his power, he actually received the blessing of this world. His power was unimaginably powerful. With just a slight movement, he easily blocked the new wisdom ancestor's attack. Instead, he even used that attack to attack the original wisdom ancestor. As this happened, the wisdom ancestor could only try his best to dodge. As he dodged, he actually felt something he had never felt before, the rejection of the world. It was as if his position and that of the invaders had been completely reversed. Instead, they had become the invaders of this world, and were the enemies of this world. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestor felt indescribable grief and indignation. As he fought against the invaders, he was continuously injured as he retreated. From time to time, he felt parts of his body being sliced off and absorbed bit by the peak powerhouse. The scale of the battle between them was extremely grand, and the power and techniques involved had reached a level that the living beings of this world couldn't even imagine. The tremors and rumbles continued to spread from the depths of the world, causing the entire world to tremble. For a time, even the invasion and counter-invasion in this world had unknowingly slowed down a little. Although the wisdom ancestors themselves didn't have deep feelings for each other, they had already become grasshoppers on a rope, after all. Their interests were already intertwined. Under such circumstances, the other progenitors of wisdom watched as the progenitor of wisdom retreated step by step. Even his own body and power were being devoured bit by bit. How could he stand aside and watch? As they roared, all sorts of power spread towards the battlefield in an attempt to support the wisdom ancestor. If there were no other peak powerhouses present, their plan might have succeeded. They might have been able to suppress the attack of the peak powerhouses and protect the wisdom ancestor. However, it was clear that that didn't happen at this time. The other peak powerhouses couldn't just watch as they besieged the first peak powerhouse who attacked. When the wisdom ancestor attacked, the other peak powerhouses also attacked at the same time. One by one, they chose a wisdom ancestor and attacked and devoured him. The number of wisdom ancestors was much smaller than the number of peak powerhouses. Even if only a portion of the peak powerhouses let go of the barriers between themselves and the world and fused with it, the number of peak powerhouses was still much higher than the number of wisdom ancestors. Under such circumstances, even if the wisdom ancestors themselves were more experienced in this realm, they still couldn't withstand the siege of the peak powerhouses. Moreover, the peak powerhouses had grown up in the chaotic battle of the new multiverse. Compared to the wisdom ancestors who lived in the mostly peaceful old multiverse, their combat standards were clearly higher. Just like that, his own battle strength was clearly inferior, and he was still being besieged. The result was already self-evident. All of the wisdom ancestors were constantly retreating at this moment. One by one, they were giving up their body parts bit by bit. Unknowingly, every single one of them had already left the depths of that world and appeared in that world, appearing before everyone. At this time, both the invaders and the anti-invaders looked at the sky in disbelief. The invaders were shocked that there were living beings in this world that could actually fight against the peak powerhouses on their side. The anti-invaders, on the other hand, were shocked that the wisdom ancestors could actually be in such a sorry state. So what they said was actually true. There really is such a powerful force hidden in this world. But why didn't they make a move after so many years? This was what one of the invaders thought. After hundreds of years of invading and anti-invading, it was naturally impossible for the invaders and anti-invaders to not have any communication. According to the anti-invaders, the invaders wouldn't be able to be complacent for too long. This was because there was still a terrifying force hidden in this world that the invaders couldn't imagine. Once this terrifying force erupted, it would be easy for it to cleanse the entire universe. Naturally, the invaders were disdainful of the news. After all, there were legends of powerhouses in every world. Based on their experience in invading, the possibility of this legend being true was extremely small. In their opinion, the powerful force that the anti-invaders claimed was nothing more than a legend. But now, after hundreds of years of fighting, when the invaders felt that they were getting more and more comfortable and relaxed, this kind of power actually appeared. How could they not be shocked? Fortunately, they also had peak experts on their side who could resist this kind of power. They could even suppress this power and win against it. Otherwise, the good situation that they had established now might really be overturned. We can't wait anymore. One of the wisdom ancestors roared angrily at this moment. With this roar, he no longer hesitated. He devoured the laws of otherworldly entities that he had analyzed and refined from the dead invader, completely releasing himself to fuse with them. After so many years of fighting, any one of the wisdom ancestors had gathered enough of the laws that belonged to the otherworldly anomalies that they had analyzed and extracted from the invaders. The reason why they hadn't fused yet was because they still couldn't make up their minds. They didn't know what they would look like after fusing, whether they would be rejected by the world, and whether they would be unable to return home because of this. Now that they were being attacked from all sides, everything about them could be devoured by the invaders at any time. Perhaps they would disappear completely in the next instant, so they naturally didn't need to hesitate or worry about the consequences. As the laws fused with them, the wisdom ancestor felt his body and mind gradually sublimate. At the same time, he sensed that the world's rejection was also rapidly strengthening. It was as if the world, which originally didn't like them, had suddenly turned from dislike to disgust, and then to hatred. However, the wisdom ancestor didn't care about this at all. At this moment, he only felt that his body, which was originally riddled with holes, was being mended. His originally strange and indescribable figure was rapidly transforming into an extremely perfect figure that was similar to the peak powerhouses that were attacking him. At this moment, the peak powerhouse that was attacking the wisdom ancestor felt that the creature in front of him suddenly exuded an aura that was similar to theirs. In fact, the creature's figure was even gradually transforming into their own. He couldn't help but be shocked. What's going on? What on earth did he eat? The peak powerhouse couldn't help but retreat, and his expression became extremely ugly. At this moment, he could no longer feel a sense of perfection from the creature in front of him. On the contrary, he felt a sense of disgust and disgust. It was as if the creature in front of him had turned from food to some sort of excrement after being digested. At this moment, thunder rumbled continuously in the sky. The rumbling sounds reverberated in the area, causing the entire area to shake. It seemed as if the foundation of the area had been shaken. At this moment, the wisdom ancestor felt extremely satisfied in the face of this thunder. A kind of heat was released from his body and gradually began to affect the surroundings, causing the surrounding space to distort indescribably. The entire world seemed to have become a flat surface in his eyes, turning into an illusory object. The continuous thunder that appeared in the sky was like applause at this moment. It didn't intimidate him at all. Instead, it made him feel a sense of joy from the bottom of his heart. "So, this is perfection," he muttered. At this moment, he felt that the world that he was extremely proud of had become so insignificant, and the living beings in his home that he originally cared about had lost all meaning in his heart. As for the peak powerhouse that had attacked him and forced him to retreat repeatedly, and in the end, a large part of his body had even been devoured by the wisdom ancestor. Now, he had become so weak that he seemed like an existence that could be crushed with a single hand. You only obtained a trace of charm. No wonder this world could accept you. The wisdom ancestor looked at the creature with a faint smile on his face. However, in just an instant, he had seen through everything and understood why he and that pinnacle expert would receive two completely different treatments in this world. He and the peak powerhouse were actually somewhat similar in nature. They were both creatures formed from spirituality born from the source of the universe and a type of law brought about by the otherworldly entity. The only difference between them was that the wisdom ancestor's law that belonged to the otherworldly entity was even denser and purer. Because of this density and purity, the wisdom ancestor had completely transcended the world. Just his existence alone was enough to cause considerable damage to the world, making it so that the world couldn't even spread its power to them. It was precisely because of this that there were only rumbles of thunder above his head at this moment, and not layers upon layers of tribulations and bolts of lightning. It was precisely because the world's power couldn't get close that there was such a rumble in comparison, although the peak powerhouse was essentially the source of the universe and the laws brought about by the otherworldly entity. Because the laws that belonged to the otherworldly entity were relatively few, they didn't exceed the limits of the world's tolerance. In this way, when they stepped into the world, it was equivalent to sending themselves to the world's mouth, allowing the world to easily and comfortably devour and assimilate them. Chapter 2601. The many wisdom ancestors who had already arrived at the surface of the ice plains did not hesitate for long in front of the barrier. They could sense that, although there were some dangers behind the barrier, there were also greater opportunities. They had already sacrificed so much for this opportunity. They had even abandoned their homes and their past. Under such circumstances, how could they retreat at the critical juncture where they were about to obtain this opportunity? This time, these wisdom ancestors did not wait for one of them to leave first. Instead, they all chose to cross the barrier together with the other wisdom ancestors. The moment they crossed the barrier, they felt a mysterious power that they had been longing for continuously surge into their bodies. The originally weak laws that belonged to the otherworldly variants in their bodies began to expand wildly. In this expansion, an indescribable sense of fullness rose from their hearts, making them all feel indescribably satisfied. At this moment, from the perspective of normal living beings, the surface of the ice field was suddenly filled with many spots of light that were expanding crazily. A large amount of heat continued to gather towards these spots of light, causing the heat of these spots of light to increase. This change made it even more conspicuous on the surface of the ice field. Although the surface temperature of the ice field was much lower than that of the normal world, the temperature of the ice field was much lower than that of the normal world. However, it did not turn into ice after all. It did not become a part of the ice field below, so there was still some heat. To the wisdom ancestors that had emerged from the depths of the ice plains, this heat was like a sun that was constantly roasting them. Although all of them could feel that their bodies were becoming more and more complete and powerful, they could also feel that their essence was constantly collapsing and dispersing in this burning process. It was as if his own foundation wasn't strong enough to support his own perfection and strength. Faced with such a situation, the wisdom ancestors could not help but feel an indescribable sense of panic. They were doing all they could to stabilize themselves and strengthen their foundations. Since they were unable to do so, they could only seek to return to the icy plains below and seek the protection of the boundless coldness below. However, it was a pity that it was easy to come out, but it was not so easy to go back. This was especially so at this moment, when their essence could be said to have been assimilated by the heat of the outside world. Now, as soon as they approached the icy plains below, they would feel their bodies and minds rapidly collapsing and being destroyed. In fact, although it was originally disintegrating their essence, it was also automatically surging into their bodies and continuously strengthening their bodies. At the same time, it started to explode, and when it came into contact with the chill, it erupted with world-shaking destructive power. The best-case scenario for the wisdom ancestors was to have half of their bodies destroyed. At this time, these ancestors of wisdom were like ordinary people who were blocked by two fierce tigers in an alley. They couldn't move forward, and they couldn't retreat for a time. They could only watch helplessly as they were assimilated by the endless heat around them. Gradually, their essence disintegrated and dispersed into the endless void around them, slowly disappearing without a trace. I should have waited a little longer. This thought appeared in the minds of the wisdom ancestors one after another. Just as they were about to completely disintegrate in the eyes of ordinary living beings, as these points of view continued to expand, they suddenly couldn't withstand the invisible existence that was constantly pouring into their bodies. In the end, under the impact of that invisible existence, they exploded and formed miniature fireworks. Countless tiny specks of light floated in the void. At this moment, there were still countless amounts of heat continuously gathering towards these light spots that had exploded, causing these light spots to continue to expand under such circumstances. In the end, at a certain moment, the specks of light expanded to a certain stage and exploded once again. Following that, the specks of light continued to absorb the endless heat and continued to expand before exploding to a certain extent. Just like this, the number of specks of light increased at an unimaginable speed. In just a few days, they had already turned into a huge ball of light that was hundreds of feet in diameter. Floating on the surface of the ice field, it was like a black hole that constantly attracted endless heat from the outside world into this ball of light. As the endless heat poured in, the surface of the ball of light constantly crackled and exploded, as if countless small bombs had appeared inside the ball of light and were detonating at every moment. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of mournful wails and screams appearing inside the ball of light, causing the originally indescribably sacred ball of light to show an indescribable coldness and strangeness. As the ball of light absorbed the heat, the surrounding temperature became lower and lower. Faintly, there were even specks of frost appearing around the ball of light. These specks of frost gathered in the void and slowly surged along with the surging heat. In the end, they seemed to have turned into a cloud of mist that shrouded the ball of light. As the ball of light moved, it produced corresponding changes, looking like the clouds and mist that followed the divine dragon. The heat in the ice field was originally much less than that in other normal regions. After the ball of light crazily absorbed the heat, the temperature naturally decreased even more rapidly. It even looked like the ice field had begun to spread upwards. At the very least, the ice field below this position began to slowly extend upwards, as if the ice field's surface was gradually bulging, gradually pushing the ball of light upwards. This kind of change continued until the newly born source of light in the depths of the ice plain below was so bright that it looked like the depths of the ice had swallowed a bright moon, appearing incomparably conspicuous. At this time, it had already been several decades since the ball of light was born. In these several decades, the ball of light had already expanded to several hundred miles wide. The entire scale had already reached a level that ordinary living beings couldn't ignore. At this time, the explosion of the light that was happening at every moment seemed incomparably huge. Countless explosions mixed together, as if a huge thunderclap was constantly ringing out from the surface of the ice field. This kind of earth-shattering activity had even affected the ice field below, causing the changes in the ice field below to become increasingly intense. Moreover, due to the loss of heat, the ice that had already begun to bulge had already turned into a mountain after several decades of development. Although it wasn't as tall as the clouds, it was at least several hundred feet away from the ground. It looked like an ice mountain had suddenly appeared in the depths of the ice field on this day, a few decades after the ball of light appeared. The thunderous explosion that came from within suddenly stopped. Then, it began to change direction. From the original unceasingly increasing in size and height, it began to continuously shrink. As it changed, the constant explosions on the surface and the depths of the ball of light gradually decreased. In the end, after another few years, all the explosions completely disappeared. The explosions within the ball of light had also completely stopped. The entire ball of light seemed to have become extremely stable, hovering at the top of the ice mountain. It slowly wriggled, as if some kind of invisible transformation was occurring within it. As for the miserable howls that lingered within the ball of light for the past few decades, at this time, it was completely gone. Moreover, there was even a faint, indescribable vitality gradually being born within the ball of light. The ball of light gradually wriggled, and as it wriggled, it gradually matched an indescribable rhythm. A rhythm that was filled with vitality. This rhythm was similar to a heartbeat, similar to breathing, and even more similar to the rise and fall of the wave. This rhythm lasted for a long time. Then, at a certain moment, the rhythm suddenly began to accelerate. As it sped up, the ball of light continued to shrink with each rhythm. In just a few days, the ball of light had already shrunk to the size of a human. At this time, suddenly, a thunderous sound appeared within the ball of light. Then, the ball of light suddenly exploded, and a figure gradually emerged from the fragments of light. The surrounding frost mist also evaporated at this instant. All the mist quickly dispersed, as if there was a sun in the center that was madly burning the frost in the surroundings. Then, with a soft plop, the figure that emerged from the light went limp and fell to the ground. This figure had the appearance of a young man. At this moment, he was lying on the ground naked. His body was steaming, and the ice under his body that came into contact with him began to melt rapidly. Gradually, it turned into ice water, then into mist, and in the end, it evaporated and disappeared into the void. The young man crawled up in a daze. He looked at himself, then at his surroundings. His eyes were filled with confusion, as if he couldn't remember anything. Who am I? Where am I? Where am I going? These three questions appeared in his heart. He faintly felt that there were countless memories in his heart, but these memories were separated from him by a layer. He could see and feel them, but he clearly understood that these were not his memories. At the very least, they were not the memories that he understood. They were more like the memories of his predecessor. In these memories, he seemed to be the ancestor of wisdom. Furthermore, it wasn't just one ancestor of wisdom, but many, many ancestors of wisdom. In those memories, he guided civilization after civilization, nurtured civilization after civilization, and carried out cultivation after cultivation. In the end, he raised himself to an unimaginable level. In the end, he transcended the world, transcended the heavens, and entered outer space. Then, due to the erosion of outer space, he died, his soul scattered. Is this outer space? There doesn't seem to be anything special. He looked up at the sky and felt that the sky was no different from the sky in his own world. Moreover, this place seems to limit my power. My current strength is at most the limit of an ordinary living being. I can't even fly. Then, he used the many techniques he obtained from his memories to examine himself, and he couldn't help but smile bitterly. At this moment, the heat in his body was continuously being stripped away by the outside world. A feeling that he had never felt in his memories surged into his heart. It was the feeling of coldness. I can't go on like this. If this goes on, I'll die. With that thought, the living being looked around, trying to find a place that could avoid the invasion of the cold. However, it was a pity that this was the depths of the vast and boundless ice field. From here, one could see that the entire area within sight was covered in ice. In a place like this, it was almost impossible to find a place that could resist the cold and maintain the heat in one's body. Am I going to lose the life I just obtained here? Looking at the ice all around him, the living being couldn't help but feel despair. Although he felt despair, this living being was the ancestor of many wisdom, after all. He wouldn't give up so easily. At this moment, although he couldn't find any hope, he still slowly climbed down the ice mountain and trudged into the distance with difficulty. A large amount of heat gathered on his body, but he didn't know how to control it. At this moment, he could only allow the cold outside to continuously neutralize his heat, causing it to continuously dissipate outside his body. This made his body seem steaming hot, as if there was smoke lingering around him. As he trudged, every step he took left a mark on the layer of ice below him that was neither deep nor shallow. As he left, these marks were quickly filled up by the cold due to the cold. In just a few breaths' time, a shallow pit was formed, and after another few breaths' time, the pit disappeared. As the heat dissipated, the living being felt more and more uncomfortable. It was as if his vitality was being stripped away bit by bit. Chapter 2602. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was at the source of the cold rule, suddenly snapped out of his daze from his deeper analysis of the source of the heat rule in his body. This feeling is somewhat similar to the extension of the bloodline. He secretly thought about the feeling that caused him to break away from that immersion, and made a judgment in his heart. The result of this judgment was quite ridiculous, and it seemed to be a situation that was completely impossible. After all, it had been billions of trillions of years since he had transmigrated, and Luo Fan had not left behind any bloodline descendants. Even if he had some descendants, they were merely obtained through various coincidences. He didn't leave behind any of his true bloodline. Under such circumstances, the sudden appearance of a bloodline descendant was an extremely absurd matter, no matter how one looked at it. However, Luo Fan did not treat this feeling as an illusion and completely ignore it. After all, at his level, everything he sensed must have a source. It was almost impossible for an illusion to happen to him. Therefore, at this moment, he put aside the absurdity and started to trace the source of that feeling, searching for the existence that made him feel this way. Luo Fan had spent quite a long time in the origin of the cold laws. Although it wasn't as long as the so-called time in the ice field, where tens of thousands of years had passed, it still wasn't as long as the so-called time in the myriad world. However, it was already quite impressive. After such a long period of analysis and refinement, his realm had improved quite a bit compared to before. Whether it was his view of the world, his body, or the amount of heat in his body, they were all much better than before. As such, the strength that he could exert in this world had unknowingly risen to the level of a pseudo-saint. This kind of strength was naturally insignificant compared to the peak level of a sixth tribulation expert. However, compared to other existences who could not use transcendent means, this kind of strength already had a crushing advantage. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and in an instant, countless information began to surge into his heart. Over the years, everything that had happened in the so-called multiverse within the ice plains, whether it was the birth of the wisdom ancestor, the plans of the wisdom ancestor, the birth of the new multiverse, the invasion of the old multiverse, and so on and so forth, everything had been imprinted in his heart without any reservation, like the lines on his palm. He had understood everything without any reservation. In the end, he locked his gaze on the ice field, at the creature that had just been born, and had a very clear humanoid figure. It was actually born with the help of my laws. From a certain point of view, it can indeed be considered as my bloodline descendant. Looking at the creature, Luo Fan did not know whether to laugh or cry. The birth of the new myriad worlds was an accident for him. It was because his body had entered the origin of the laws of cold, causing some strange ripples to form in the origin of the laws of cold. The effects were mutual. The origin of the laws of cold could stimulate the origin of the laws of heat in Luo Fan's body, causing the mysteries of the origin of the laws of heat to be revealed in front of Luo Fan. Similarly, the origin of the laws of heat would definitely have a reaction against the origin of the laws of cold. This reaction might not be as strong as the stimulation of the origin of the laws of cold to the origin of the laws of heat, but it still existed given the position of the source of the cold law in this ice field. The final effect of such a change was rather impressive. As a result, the new myriad worlds were born. As a result, the entire ice field was violently shaken. As a result, the ancestors of wisdom saw a way to transcend, and they did their best to refine the laws that had appeared in the depths of the ice field because of them. Then, the creature that was shivering in front of Luo Fan was finally born. All of this could be said to be a fortuitous coincidence, but it could also be said to be an inevitability within chance. As long as Luo Fan entered the origin of the laws of cold, then all of these changes would eventually appear. The only difference was the length of time, as well as the identity of the existence that ultimately formed this figure. Naturally, Luo Fan did not care much about this so-called bloodline descendant. After all, its birth was merely an accident, and it was not his will. Moreover, it was only born because of the laws he had influenced. Strictly speaking, it could not be considered a bloodline descendant. Under these various circumstances, how could Luo Fan admit that the creature was his bloodline descendant? However, although he acknowledged that the creature was his bloodline descendant, it was still born because of the laws he had influenced, and there was a subtle connection between them. Hence, Luo Fan could not just watch it freeze to death on the surface of the ice field. At this moment, seeing that the creature was walking slower and slower, and that its body was gradually turning into ice, Luo Fan finally sighed. With a slight thought, a wave of heat trembled in his body, and then disappeared without a trace. Then, on the surface of the ice field that was at least a few million kilometers away from him, a wave of heat suddenly appeared above the head of the creature that was trudging with difficulty. This wave of heat was so grand, so vast. The moment it appeared, the surrounding ice directly evaporated and turned into smoke, completely dispersing. At this moment, the creature also felt indescribable waves of warmth continuously seeping into its body from all directions, causing the chill in its body to completely disperse at an unimaginable speed. "What is this?" The creature was stunned. It raised its head and looked in the direction where the heat came from. In that position, there was a group of invisible existences that were rotating slightly. The invisible object itself was incorporeal. Ordinary creatures should not be able to discover its existence even if they looked in that direction. However, at this moment, due to its own characteristics and the fact that it carried too much heat, the surrounding air became extremely distorted and deformed. Unknowingly, that invisible and intangible existence was highlighted. It was precisely because of this that the creature, who was still no different from an ordinary person, could see the invisible object at a glance. What a powerful source of heat! A sense of astonishment surfaced in its heart. To him, this shapeless and intangible existence was simply the purest and most powerful source of heat in the world. It felt like even the sun in the sky couldn't compare to this source of heat. Not to mention anything else, at this moment, the ice below where it was standing was also rapidly rising. It continuously turned from ice into mist, continuously rising into the air, and gradually dissipating in the void. If not for the endless chill surging up at every moment to resist this corrosion, the creature would have fallen into the deep pit that was formed due to the disappearance of the ice, as if it had fallen into an abyss. However, even so, he felt that the ice beneath his feet was no longer cold. Instead, it was warm. Stepping on it was indescribably comfortable. This was the effect of the equilibrium formed by the interaction of heat and cold. At a glance, the ice within a range of several hundred kilometers was covered by the mist. Clearly, this was because the range of effect of this ball of heat was not limited to the creature's surroundings, but the entire area within a range of several hundred kilometers. All the ice in this entire area was simultaneously enduring the test of this heat, enduring the scorching heat. At this moment, the ball of heat shook slightly, and like a falling meteorite, it ruthlessly smashed towards the creature. In this world, this creature could only display the strength of an ordinary creature. Faced with this scene of a falling meteorite, it could only raise its hand to block it. It could only watch as the ball of heat directly rushed into its body. As the heat rushed in, the creature felt as if it had swallowed the entire sun. Endless heat was continuously released. Not only did it fill the interior of its body, but it also nourished its body as if it was being roasted. It nourished its spirit, and it nourished the heat that had almost been worn out in its body. As this happened, the creature's body seemed to have turned into a sun. Endless heat kept being released from its body, even burning the air around it, causing the surrounding air to turn into hot wind that blew in all directions. As the wind blew, the creature's body began to float involuntarily. It gradually left the ice and flew into the sky. Of course, it was not because it had obtained the heat, but because it was able to display extraordinary abilities in this world and display the effects of extraordinary abilities. Instead, because of the heat, the air around it expanded and became less dense, forming a difference in density between it and the air outside. As a result, buoyancy was produced, and the creature's body began to float upwards. One must know that around this creature, there was no obvious boundary between the air that was being burned and the air outside. Even so, the buoyancy was enough for the creature to float. This was enough to show how terrifying the heat coming from its body was. Only when the terrifying heat caused the temperature of the surrounding air to rise rapidly enough that the exchange of air could not make up for the reduced density of the air again could something like this happen. Go, this place is still too dangerous for you now. When you can use extraordinary abilities, come back to see your home. At this moment, a voice appeared in the creature's mind out of nowhere. This voice came from the source of heat, or rather, from the existence that sent the source of heat into its body. Who are you? Who am I? The creature shouted at this moment. Compared to itself, it seemed to be more concerned about this. However, the source of heat did not reply to this question. At this moment, the heat from the source of heat was continuously emitted, continuously filling its body and fusing with its heat. It even faintly controlled the heat in its body to form an extremely crude circulation inside its body, absorbing more and more heat into this circulation. Following these changes, the amount of heat released from the creature's body continuously decreased. As the heat decreased, the speed at which the temperature of the surrounding air rose began to slow down. The buoyancy that was supporting it naturally began to decrease. As a result, the creature's speed of ascension also began to gradually slow down. Fortunately, when it stopped, it was already high up in the sky. Looking down at the ice field below, it could already barely see the boundary and the outline of the basin. Although this creature had just been born not long ago, it was formed from the many fragments of the wisdom ancestors after all. It possessed most of the memories of the wisdom ancestors. Although it could not say that it completely possessed the strength and wisdom of the wisdom ancestors, it also knew many tricks to using power. At this moment, seeing that it could not get an answer from the source of heat, and if it did not take action, it would probably fall back down like a stone and smash into a meat paste on the surface of the ice field. The creature could only sigh and control a portion of the heat that it could control, spurting it out of the many acupoints on its back. As the heat spurted out, its body was pushed back by an unimaginable force. It left a white mark in the void and quickly flew towards the end of the ice field in the distance. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace. It had listened to the voice from the source of heat and left this ice field first. One day, when it could use its extraordinary power, it would return to this ice field to explore it. It won't be long before I return. This was what the creature was thinking at the last moment before it left. The reason why it thought this way was naturally not just because it was conceited. Instead, it could sense that the heat contained in the source of heat that had entered its body was far greater than the limits of its imagination. With the support of such a vast amount of heat, it would be successful no matter what it did. Even if it used its extraordinary power, it should not be difficult.